to the fourth public hearing for the inquiry into road tolling regimes. Before I commence, I'd like to acknowledge the Gadigal people who are the traditional custodians of the land on which the Parliament sits. I'd also like to pay respects to elders past, present and emerging of the Eora Nation and extend that respect to other Aboriginals present. Today we will be hearing from the Australian Competition and Consumer Commission and representatives of Transurban Westconnex. Before we commence, I'd like to make some brief comments about the procedures for today's hearing. While parliamentary privilege applies to witnesses giving evidence today, it does not apply to what witnesses say outside of their evidence at the virtual hearing. I therefore urge witnesses to be careful about comments you may make to the media or to others after you complete your evidence. Committee hearings are not intended to provide a forum for people to make adverse reflections about others under the protection of parliamentary privilege. In that regard, it is important that witnesses focus on the issues raised by the inquiry terms of reference and that they avoid naming individuals unnecessarily. All witnesses have a right to procedural fairness according to the Procedural Fairness Resolution adopted by the House in 2018. There may be some questions that a witness can only answer if they have more time or with certain documents to hand, and in those circumstances, witnesses are advised that they can take those questions on notice and provide an answer to us within 21 days. Today's proceedings are being streamed live, and a transcript will be placed on the committee's website once it becomes available. Finally, to assist our Hansard reporters, may I remind both committee members and witnesses to speak into their microphones. As we have a number of witnesses in person and via video conference, it may be helpful to identify who the questions are directed to and who is speaking in response. So I now welcome our first witnesses. First, could each witness please state their name and position title and then swear either an oath or an affirmation? And I'll start with you, Mr. Luna.
So Tom Loyner, I'm the Executive General Manager of the Mergers, Exemptions and Digital Division at the ACCC. And I'll take the affirmation. I solemnly, sincerely and truly declare and affirm that the evidence now about to be given by me shall be the truth, the whole truth and nothing but the truth.
Thank you, Mr. Loyner. Mr. Schroeder, could you please state your full name, position, title and then swear either an oath or affirmation?
Matthew Schroeder, I'm General Manager, Infrastructure and Transport, Access and Pricing at the ACCC. I solemnly, sincerely and truly declare and affirm that the evidence now about to be given by me shall be the truth, the whole truth and nothing but the truth.
Thank you. And Mr. McCracken-Hewson, could you please state your full name and position and then swear either the oath or the affirmation?
Daniel McCracken-Hewson, General Manager, Merger Investigations Branch at the ACCC. I solemnly, sincerely and truly declare and affirm that the evidence now about to be given by me shall be the truth, the whole truth and nothing but the truth.
Thank you very much to all of you and to all of you for appearing today. Would you like to start by making a short statement?
We're happy to go direct to questions. Thank you.
Excellent. Thank you. Well, I will commence with the opposition.
Great. Thank you, Chair. John Graham for the opposition. I might start. Thank you for your submission. It was very helpful. I might start with some of the comments of your Chairman, Rod Sims, after the full privatisation of Westconnex went through. He said on the 20th of September this year, he made this statement: by continually selling to Transurban, they have made it very hard for anyone else to compete with Transurban. Less competition means either the government gets less proceeds for a privatisation sale or the bidder puts in a higher toll cost for motorists. They were quite strong statements. I'm just interested in any other context you can give the committee about the ACCC's view post the full privatisation of Westconnex about the status of these toll roads.
Thank you. I can take that one. What Mr. Sims is really talking about there is competition for toll roads in future. And so the concern that we had when we looked at the sale of Westconnex is one of the key concerns is what is the impact on future processes when the government wants to build a new toll road? Will there be sufficient competitive tension in the bids for those toll roads such that the government extracts a good deal, the users of the road and the government itself? And what we were concerned about is as Transurban grows and has more and more of the roads, its incumbency advantage, so the advantage of being the incumbent can get stronger and stronger. So it has modelers that sit there analysing the data. It has all of the gantry data from the gantries that measure when you go through the toll. And other bidders don't have that position of incumbency. So can they constrain the bids that Transurban puts in future? I think what Mr. Sims was referring to is over time, if Transurban becomes more and more has this established position of incumbency, that advantage could become larger and larger. But the point he was really making was that in a sense, is in the hands of the government. The government doesn't have to sell new roads to Transurban or the right to have a concession. It could give them to another bidder if it wanted to ensure that other bidders also have a position of incumbency in future.
And what's the risk here? What might drivers pay? It means drivers might pay more under those circumstances. What's the risk if the government policy, if the government gets that wrong?
Well, I think normally, as I understand it, the way this works is the government goes out to tender and it lists the toll rates in that tender. So it's basically saying, for example, you've got a right to charge $4 on that road for the next 20 years, and there's escalation measures and different measures for trucks and all of that detail that I'm sure you're aware of. So that's what it puts forward. And then where the harm could come in is in how much people are willing to bid for that. So Transurban is in essence the only player with a position of incumbency. It's the only player that has all of that detailed modelling ability to really confirm that its traffic forecasts are accurate. Then the concern is the bids will be low. So in essence, it's just hurting government consolidated revenue because it will get less for that road when it's offered. So indirectly hurting all New South Wales taxpayers, I guess.
And you're right to draw attention to the fact that the facts have changed significantly here over the recent years in Sydney and New South Wales. The previous committee that looked at this road tolling question and the potential question about whether Transurban had a monopoly found that it did not. There was quite a strong committee comment saying at that point in time Transurban did not have a monopoly position. Things have changed significantly since then. On that question about whether Transurban has a monopoly or something like it in Sydney over toll roads, what is the view of the ACCC as we sit here today?
So if we look at when Westconnex was offered up, there were competing bids. So to sort of, in that market for bidding for future toll roads, I don't think it was right at that stage to say Transurban has a monopoly. It faced competing bids. That was reported in the press. And then going forward, for future potential toll roads that might arise in the future, I guess the question is, will there be competing bids that can competitively constrain what Transurban puts in? And because of the ACCC's concerns about this issue, we did require that Transurban publish all of its gantry data on a website that's made public, because that was the critical input that we felt that Transurban has this advantage when bidding for future toll roads, because it has this source of data that no one else had. But by forcing them to publish that data and make that available to other bidders, we felt that, we're evening up the playing field. So future bidders, when they're doing their traffic forecasts and all that to work out how much they can bid for a future
come back
road.
to that. I'll come back to ask you about that data question, but on the question of competing bids, when it came to the second tranche of Westconnex, that sale, did Transurban face a competing bid?
I'll have to take that on notice. Unfortunately, I can't recall this. So you're talking about the 49%,
Yes, yeah.
the recent transaction.
No one claimed the benefits they potentially could have claimed for their bid costs. There was no indication that in the end there was more than one bid for that second tranche of the sale.
Yeah, I mean, we're running the sale process,
understood.
obviously. So you'd have to check. And as you know, our job is to enforce Section 50, which we talked about in our submission. And if there were other bids, they wouldn't raise any competition issues, for the ACCC. So it wouldn't have sort of been of interest to the ACCC in a sense.
On that
We
bid
did obviously look at
process, though,
Transurban taking that.
can I ask you this? would it be of concern to the ACCC if there was no competing bid in that process? You're obviously concerned about that in future. You'd also be concerned if, in fact, that was the case with this last tranche. Is that correct?
Well, yeah, I mean, if there's a lack of competing bids, I think it's a poor outcome, for New South Wales, the public, because they're not necessarily extracting the best deal for these assets. Now, what actually counts as a bid? I know there was at least interest from other players, whether they put in a final bid or not. I'm not privy to that, and I don't actually know. But even if they're expressing interest, it probably constrains what Transurban might have bid for the 49%, because Transurban's sitting there thinking, well, we need to make sure we outbid so-and-so, even if, and they would have put in their proposal to the New South Wales government. So, look, I don't know if they put in a final bid or not. I'm not privy to that information. But I know there was at least some competitive tension, because there were other parties that were at least interested in the 49%.
Perhaps a worrying sign about the future you're pointing to, where there may not be that competitive tension or those competing bids.
Well, possibly, but a 49% stake is quite different. So let's say there was the beaches link in future, and that goes out to tender, where you get full control of that link, if you bid it and win it, compared to bidding for a 49% stake, where Transurban is basically sitting in the controlling seat, and sure, you'll get some board seats and things like that, but it's not your asset, you won't control it. So I suspect the nature of a 49% interest might naturally temper some of the interest you might get from, for example, international toll road companies and things like that, because they want to be in control of the asset. So they may be less interested in that minority stake.
Mr. Lorna, you've talked about the requirements that the ACCC applied to Transurban to release some of the data for those toll roads, and that's certainly public in great detail. One of the concerns in the market is that there are still data advantages that Transurban holds by virtue of the analysis they're able to do, by virtue of actually holding the assets. What is the view of the ACCC on that question? Are you comfortable that this has succeeded? I note in your submission you actually say state governments should implement broader measures to ensure that exclusive traffic data held by toll road operators is shared. Can you tell us what those are?
Well, so there's a few parts that I'll answer the last part first, which was, ideally, we think when a concession is offered, the government should just compel the company to release all the traffic data. So it's not on the ACCC. I mean, the Section 87B undertaking, sure, it's there, but this is really a New South Wales government issue. So we've actually said, maybe the New South Wales government should just encourage all of this data to be made public on all toll roads, so that it doesn't sit in this Section 87B undertaking that the ACCC monitors.
Yep.
In answer to your earlier question, sorry, I've just lost track. I apologise. Could you repeat the earlier part of the question?
Look, really, I'm interested to know what other things could state government do in relation to data. Yep. Are you comfortable? Clearly not, given your submission. What else could be done in this space to make sure that this data advantage over government or over other providers is neutralised in the interests of competition?
So there is another type of data which I think it's called individual trip data. So it literally tells you if car X entered on this entry point and where did it exit and how many minutes later. We actually looked at whether Transurban uses that trip data in its modelling, and then in turn it uses the model to bid for future toll roads. And we put this in our public documentation, they don't. We felt they don't use that individual trip data, they rely on the gantry data. So that's why we really focused that undertaking on that gantry data down to the 15-minute intervals that you can see published.
Yeah.
Now, what else can the government do? So to make sure you get competitive bids, you need to try and even the playing field with the data, and we think the undertaking goes a lot of the way there. We couldn't think of other data that would be particularly useful. We know this trip data exists, but we don't think we didn't find that Transurban used that data to any significant extent, so I don't think that really changes things. But the other thing the government can do is give time for other bidders to build their model.
Yep.
So if you're, a Spanish toll road company, I think there's a big company in Spain that's always interested in, entering toll roads, around the world, and there's probably a few US companies. What you need is some people that can do the detailed traffic forecasts for Sydney, and that takes time to build those models, to bring in that expertise, and to really try and refine those models. They do all kinds of complicated things. They sort of run the model and then test whether it predicted.
What time period would you consider? What time period would you consider to be a minimum for that sort of complicated bid process that you're describing?
Look, I don't think we've got a fixed view. I mean, I would encourage you to talk to other potential interested parties. We know IFM were interested, for example, and ask them, how much time do you actually need? But my instinct, and I don't want to say this is a fixed view, would at least sort of 9 to 12 months.
Yeah.
It would be my instinct. But, the ACCC doesn't have a firm view on what exactly is required.
That is very helpful guidance. I might turn finally and then hand to my colleague just to one other issue, which is, given what you've outlined, the ACCC's concerns are, which are future toll roads, potentially future toll road privatisations, do you envisage that the ACCC will have a role in future when it potentially comes to the Western Harbour Tunnel, to the M6 Stage 1, to the Beaches Link, to the M7, M12 extensions? Is it on the ACCC's radar that they may need to oversight, they may need to intervene in these toll road deals in future?
We will look at them carefully under Section 50 of the Act, which is the section of the Act that prohibits acquisitions that might substantially lessen competition. Now, and we've looked at, I think, all of Transurban's acquisitions over the years, and I can't see that pattern changing. We will look at them very closely.
Thank you.
I might just, thank you, Daniel Mookie as well from the opposition. I might just follow up on the line of questioning that my colleague just initiated. Under Section 50, you have the power to stop acquisitions and or mergers that substantially lessen competition in a marketplace. That's correct?
Well, it's often a perception the ACCC can just stop deals. It's actually not correct. It's an enforcement regime. So all the law says is you cannot buy a company if it substantially lessens competition. That's literally all it says. There's nothing about the ACCC's powers or anything like that. If the ACCC makes a decision that it thinks there's a breach of that provision, it actually needs to go to the federal court
Indeed.
to stop it. And it's only the federal court that can enforce Section 50. So we effectively have set up a process where we the whole process is designed to work out the ACCC's view on whether we think there's a possible breach of Section 50. And if we do, then we need to take action in the federal court, which is the ultimate sort of place of arbitration, if you like,
Indeed.
or determination, I should say.
I appreciate that, but you have to take a view about what a market is. And I'm wondering, when it comes to toll roads, do you define the market as being Sydney? Do you define it as being New South Wales? Do you define it as being Australia?
If I recall correctly, there were two markets of interest when we looked at Westconnex, which is the most recent example. So there was the market for bidding for future toll roads, or I can't remember the exact words, but it was words to that effect. And I think we restricted that to New South Wales. Now, whether you took a national market or not, it probably doesn't make too much difference to the actual technical analysis, because ultimately it's not about market definition, it's about the impact on competition. And then there was a second market that we analysed, or markets, which is actual road-on-road, day-to-day competition in a sense. Does Road X that Transurban is looking at buying compete with Road Y that they already own in a day-to-day sense? That's a sort of second market, which is a very different market.
Okay, that's helpful. But should you find yourself in a position where we do have Transurban looking to buy in the future the Western Harbour Tunnel, the Northern Beaches Link, the F6, other forms of toll roads, what would the reaction of the ACCC be, and what would the process be that you would follow?
So normally, and what's happened for most of these deals so far, is Transurban would come to us with their proposal. So we're proposing to buy this asset and seek informal clearance, and that's that process we've talked about in the past. We would if there are prima facie some potential concerns, we would kick off a public review, and this is what we did with Westconnex. And we put it up on our website, and we talk to everyone in the industry. We do a call out for submissions, and we use our compulsory power. So we extract documents from the parties, documents from other bidders. We examine them under oath. So it's a very sort of intensive investigative process with a high degree of transparency to the parties. You know, we let them know what the concerns are and let them respond, etc. And then ultimately we make that decision on whether we think there's a potential breach of Section 50 and then whether we can argue that case in the federal court.
Okay. Can I just move on to a part of your submission which you talk about sort of toll pricing, I guess. And you've said that, I think, that tolls, I think it was on page 3, tolls on privately built roads are generally above the cost of the provision of the roads, and there is a concern that pricing frameworks for toll road operations could be used as a source of government revenue rather than price for the efficient use of the road network. Are you able to take us through what led you to sort of have that concern and why you feel that privately built toll roads, why do you think that privately built toll roads tend to be charged at a higher rate than the cost of provision of the roads?
I'll hand that over to Mr. Schroeder. Thank you.
Thank you. Our concerns are that, firstly, if you're saying why would they be greater than the costs of the
Well, actually, take us through your
production of the
concerns.
roads?
That's probably a better way of putting it. If you
Okay,
just take us through
sure.
your concerns with how tolls are currently being priced, and then we can probably follow up from there.
Yeah. So it isn't specific to how tolls are priced. Our concerns are more broad, and we've been advocating around government privatisations and how they've been run, not specific to New South Wales and not specific to toll roads. We've been in the public domain on ports and other privatisations that have occurred. The concern is that there is an incentive for the government of the day to privatise assets with monopoly characteristics or very, very strong market power without appropriate constraints on it to maximise the upfront capital returns, which in effect cause a tax on the people of that jurisdiction in the future. So, for example, if you're privatising a port which has monopoly power, you'll get a higher price if you don't put in an appropriate regulatory regime which constrains their pricing. But you'll get a higher upfront return for the sale of it, or for the sale of the concession. But ultimately, that can be damaging to the economy. So that's where we're coming at.
Did you have follow-up?
I did have
You can
follow-up.
You can complete your line of questioning if
Okay.
you like.
So, and look, I accept that, Mr. Schroeder, that is a concern that the ACCC has articulated on multiple instances, particularly when it comes to port transactions as well. And whilst I am tempted to go follow that path, I might stick to the toll roads, stay on the straight and narrow. But in respect to the actual, is it your view that some of that behaviour in which governments have chosen not to impose a regime that might limit the ability for them to extract a high price has applied to the sale of toll roads in New South Wales?
We don't have a specific view that has occurred for toll roads in New South Wales now.
So when you then say, given the tolls on privately built roads are generally above the cost of provision of the roads, there is a concern that pricing frameworks for toll road operations could be used as a source of government revenue, what do you mean? So
it stands to reason that the pricing regime around privatised toll roads need to be above cost because the toll road operators will need to make a profit.
Indeed.
So, pardon?
Yes, indeed, yes.
Sorry. That's a general principle. The concern is, though, that if the concession deed, the terms around the concession deed don't constrain the toll road operator appropriately, and we've seen some evidence of that in other industries, then that would lead to an inefficient outcome.
I think my last question before I return the chair to her time is in respect to that particular concern that you just raised around the way they've been priced to cover the cost of capital plus a return, is there sufficient transparency and information release that would allow the ACCC and or the public to properly scrutinise whether or not the manner in which toll roads are priced are fair and reasonable, or at least reasonable from the perspective of competition, as opposed to the perspective of encouraging monopoly or monopoly returns in exchange for a higher upfront payment. Are we transparent enough? What else should we be saying that should be the sort of the data release or transparency principles that should be applied when it comes to concession pricing and the financial returns that are available to the buyer of the concession?
So again, we haven't looked specifically at this, but as a general principle, markets work better when there's more information available. And in the same way that we'd like to have information available for competitors and future competitors that would be bidding for future toll roads, it would the more information, the better. But again, that isn't a statement that we don't have the sufficient information, because that isn't something that we've done work on.
Thank you. Just picking up on that discussion, I guess if we look at section 50 and the prohibition on mergers and acquisitions are likely to have the effect of substantially lessening competition in a market, when you're assessing a particular acquisition, how far back do you go in terms of looking at the at whether or not the process was competitive as possible? Are you concerned only with the particular transaction, or do you go further back to look at the relationship between the parties?
It's actually a forwards-looking test. It's asking, does this acquisition, which is usually in future, occasionally it's already happened, but in all the cases of Transurban it's always been in future, will it lessen competition in future? So now, obviously, you look back as far as is appropriate, and relevant. Any relevant source of information that helps you to predict the future impact on competition is relevant. So past conduct, past bidding results, etc., is all relevant.
So, okay, so we're looking at sort of what the future holds, I guess, which is bounded then by what exists at the moment. But if, for example, earlier you referred to, obviously for a 49% stake, there would be, you might expect less competition because the purchaser isn't going to end up with, control over the asset. To what extent is it relevant that the acquisition structure has been set up like that from the beginning? So when the 51% was sold, was it a consideration as to whether the fact that it had been structured like that would lead then to less competition for the 49%?
Well, look, when we looked at the 51%, in our minds, we just treated it as control. So in effect, akin to 100%. That was where the potential competition effects were really likely to be, with whichever acquisition led to control. We still looked at the 49% because we still had to ask, well, if someone else got that 49%, would they get some of that incumbency advantage, and would they be able to be a sort of a stronger future competitive threat to Transurban in future? That's the question we asked, and we basically decided no, it will make little difference. So I don't think we looked at the 51% thinking, well, what impact does that have when they sell the 49% in future? It was just, we looked at the 51% and just thought about, well, that's the controlling stake. That's the critical piece, and that's the basis we looked at it.
Okay, so when we're looking at that, then that incumbency advantage going forward, which presumably is a major barrier to entry really for other entrants into the market, does that incumbency, from the perspective of your analysis, does the incumbency advantage also include, for example, the ease with which Transurban would, given how many deals it's done, would be able to contact the government in the future, or the relationships between particular private players and government, and the other aspects of that incumbency advantage that could lessen potential competition in the future? Is that part of the analysis?
Look, we didn't look at the relationships between Transurban and government as a sort of standalone incumbency advantage. What we more focused on was that data advantage, and also the advantage Transurban just has in having, it has these modelers, traffic forecasters and modelers in-house, sitting there in Sydney, analysing all of the data, thinking through, well, how many people are going to go on the beaches link, how many people, they're already, I'm sure they're analysing all those questions, and that gives it a bit of an advantage. So to ensure competition in future, it's all about trying to level the playing field a bit against that by giving other bidders more time and giving them access to the data, which hopefully that undertaking we've spoken about does. The relationship with government, look, it's not something we've really thought about, so we really don't have strong or significant comments on that, I don't think.
So when you're looking at whether the acquisition lessens competition in the future, are you also then concerned with the process by which the bidding has occurred, I guess? How does that fit in with looking at the future when we're talking about what's happening at a sort of process level?
No, it's not really relevant. What we're looking at is a world where we'll just take Westconnex as an example. So we're looking, in that deal, we're thinking, well, if Transurban takes the majority stake in Westconnex, we're going to have a future world like that, versus a future world where someone else gets the majority stake in Westconnex, and we compare those two worlds to see if one would be much more competitive than the other, which would be indicative that one substantially lessens competition compared to the other. We're not, our role is not to sort of intervene in how the New South Wales government runs its tender process or anything like that. All we did was make some comments that if you want to even up the playing field in future, here's some ideas on how you might do that.
So although you've put in place you've suggested some sensible recommendations about how the government might increase the competitiveness of the process in order to get a better, better bang for the buck, whatever that expression is, then whether or not they do take up those recommendations wouldn't impact on the future decision by ACCC in relation to another acquisition.
So it's a good question. I think I'm just trying to think how to answer this. If we thought that whoever bought Westconnex, if Transurban buys Westconnex, then they're going to forever and a day always buy every future toll road in Sydney because the government's not going to try and induce competition, that would have been a factor in our analysis. So I guess we are trying to we're thinking in our minds, well, that's not in the government's interest. Surely the government will the New South Wales government will want some competitive tension so it can get more for taxpayers or cheaper, road, like it could have a lower toll but still get a good bid price, for example. Surely that's in its interest. So I think it is in the New South Wales government's interest, and we would have factored that in to try and even up that playing field for future toll roads. Now, the extent to which they do is, and how that impacted our analysis is really tricky, but it was certainly a factor in our analysis, and I think we say this in our assessment of the decision, which is the New South Wales government can influence that in the way it runs these tenders in future. And just something we haven't touched on yet is unsolicited proposals. I mean, the ACCC saw evidence that unsolicited proposals earn a higher rate of return than ones that go competitive tender, which to us sort of makes perfect sense. If you don't go out to tender and try and get competitive bids, and instead you just go down the unsolicited proposal route, that you're not really putting it out to see if there's competitive alternatives and putting competitive pressure on Transurban. So the other suggestion we had was try and restrict the number of unsolicited proposals that you accept. I think they should be restricted to truly unique circumstances and try and encourage other bidders. If someone comes in with an unsolicited proposal, why not convert it to a tender process and put it out there, give other bidders a year to make their proposals? And sorry, I know I've gone further than your question. There was examples in the US where the incumbent has come up with a road proposal, and then the government sought interest from other bidders, and other bidders have come up with actually better road proposals that are more efficient because of the design of the ramps and the number of lanes and all these things. So they've extracted a better deal for consumers and the taxpayer by going out to tender and seeing what other ideas are out there.
So how realistic do you think it is then, if we've got Sydney's toll roads, we've got 11 of the 12 being owned by Transurban, how realistic do you think it is in the future that we would get another player who would be able to compete with Transurban to bid for another toll road?
Look, it's difficult for us to answer that question, but there was interest in Westconnex from other bidders. And I think if the government were to make the process, give other bidders sufficient time, and there's other techniques you can use, such as underwriting bid costs and things like that, which I know was mentioned before, to encourage interest so that they go and invest in all the modelling, they buy that traffic expertise in. I think there's a lot of interest worldwide, especially if you look at the superannuation sector. They've got, they want to find assets like this that have nice set returns. So I think certainly, I think there will be a lot of interest in future toll roads. But look, we don't analyse. So we're not like monitoring the toll roads industry on an ongoing basis. We just look at transactions as they come to us. So I say that with not a high level of confidence, if that makes sense. But I think if the government uses appropriate techniques, it could get more interest.
Thank you. So, no, I've just completely forgotten the question I just had. I'm going to pass over to the government members. Mr. Mallard.
Thank you. Thank you, Madam Chair. And you've got one government member here. There's 3 competing inquiries today, so I apologise that my colleagues... Competition, ACCC competition for committees. Apologise for that. And thank you for your submission, and I think the observations, frankly, are quite helpful. New territory for all governments in regards to this infrastructure outlay that we're doing in New South Wales, historic, and I'm sure Treasury's taken note of those observations. But your judgment on the transaction on Westconnex and situation hasn't flagged a red flag in regards to Section 50. ACCC has green-lighted that transaction. So you just noted some concerns going forward.
That's right. Well, we felt that there was a potential substantial lessening of competition in that market for bidding for future toll roads. But to address that concern, because of that data advantage we spoke about, the data incumbency advantage, but to address that competition concern, we accepted the undertaking that forces them to publish the data, the 15-minute gantry data. So we did think there was a competition problem, but we felt it was addressed by that data commitment.
Well, obviously that data, the vehicle trips, the amount of vehicles, that data must be sensitive, commercial sensitive data for any company that's providing a service. So asking them to release that, I mean, that has share market implications, share price implications.
It does, and look, I understand Transurban manages that by it announces the data or the aggregate results of the data to the ASX just before it puts it on the website to manage the sort of ASX sensitivities of the data. And if you actually look in the undertaking, it actually says that. It says the data needs to be put on the website within several days. I can't remember the number,
hours,
but yeah, after they've released their midterm reports and things like that. So it's clearly sensitive data because they need to manage those ASX responsibilities.
With strong regulatory controls around that too, and penalties if they don't report it correctly at the right time, yes. I mean, picking up on the Chair's comments around, and your response around future competition for toll road privatisations in New South Wales, my understanding, I could be corrected, is that the 49% purchase of the remaining of Westconnex was made of 3 investors, I think a super fund or 2 super funds, overseas super funds, and then Transurban. So the capital, my observation would be from that, the capital, as you said in your answer before, like super funds looking for stable returns, they can't run a toll road. They'll look for an operator, ideally a locally well-placed operator, that can manage that toll road operation, but they invest. Is that your understanding of what's happened with that 49%?
That is my understanding for that 49%. But I would add that...
So Transurban themselves per se don't own it. It's that's a consortium.
Yeah. I think some of their assets in Sydney are majority owned by Transurban, but quite a few of them are consortiums. But I would note that some of the superannuation firms do through organisations like IFM and things like that, they do actually own and manage assets. So that's not unheard of. That's another way you can take control of these assets and actually, in effect, run them yourself.
For the layperson driving their car on Westconnex, they wouldn't see Transurban as having being a monopoly because they've got other road options. I mean, that's the consumer's view of a monopoly. You've gone down the path of for the government perspective in terms of competitive tension for future purchases, but the consumers don't see that as a monopoly. Would you agree with that? I mean, it's not like Telstra buying Optus. It's not that type of situation. It's not a consumer issue.
Well, in effect, I mean, we see...
I didn't interrupt the opposition, so yeah, thank you.
We see each toll road as, in effect, a monopoly in itself, in the sense that if you're, roughly at one end of the road and you want to get to the other, sure, you can go on public roads, but the time limit is going to mean that it's, in many circumstances, not going to be a substitute. But the thing is, although it's a monopoly, it's regulated, in effect, through the concession deed, which sets the price. So those concession deeds, which set the toll price, are kind of regulating the conduct and the pricing of Transurban. So although, in effect, like if Transurban owned all these roads and there was no concession deeds, they would price a lot higher, I suspect. So that concession deed is sort of a form of regulation that's set up, when you put these out to tender. From a consumer's perspective, I mean, yeah, it's difficult to comment. I don't know if I've got much to add on that.
Cast our minds back to the early days of the planning for Westconnex, and the government couldn't find private sector partner. It was just too complex and too risky, and the government had to take it on itself and de-risk it. And then Westconnex came on board once the government had done pretty much the heavy lifting of the risk and did that transaction. So it's quite a unique product in that regard.
Yeah, construction risk is another big factor that impacts on the extent to which you get competitive bids for a proposal. There's huge construction risk, which I suspect Westconnex would have fallen into that category given all the tunnelling and planning problems and stuff like that. So the government, as you say, I understand, look, I wasn't, it's not our decision making, but I understand that whole was designed in a way where they got it going and solved a lot of those risk issues so that in turn they would get high bids for the process, because some of that risk had been removed. But ultimately, there's still a risk on traffic forecasts. I mean, no one knows. I know some parts of Westconnex are completed and that you can see the traffic, but when it's all done and dusted, no one knows how many cars are going to go on that. And we've seen around Australia many, toll roads have been constructed, and the bidders have put in a bid thinking that traffic forecasts are going to be X, and they've turned out to be much lower, and that has harmed them, obviously.
Well, the classic one is the Cross City Tunnel built by Labor, which went bankrupt, and I think ultimately Transurban acquired that out of receivership. But that they used traffic forecasting there that was clearly too optimistic. Do you look back at that sort of example when you're looking at the situation?
Well, what we did see, all of the people who are bidding for these future toll roads know the story about the Cross City Tunnel, and there's another example in Brisbane. So, to put it in colloquial terms, that makes them nervous about their traffic forecasts. And it makes their financiers nervous as well. They're like, they don't want a repeat scenario. So it puts more importance on that traffic modelling as a critical factor when you make a bid. That you need the financiers to be confident in your model. You need to be confident the model has to be done using the absolute best data and the best traffic expertise you can find. And that's, again, why we thought that data undertaking was really important, to ensure that competitive bidders in future have access to the data and can really invest in their traffic forecast.
Thank you. I was interested in your more general observations on road tolling charging in your submission. I thought that was some interesting observations. So you make an observation around fuel excise, and that it's an inefficient. It doesn't send a signal to consumers about their impact upon the road network. Do you want to unpackage that a bit? You lean towards saying the tolling regime is actually better signalling to the market in terms of use of roads and congestion and so forth. Do you want to unpackage that a bit for us, that observation?
So I might answer that, Mr. Millard. Look, The ideal system is the most efficient system would be one that takes account of the costs that are imposed on the system. So that's weight, because weight creates damage to roads, distance travelled, location and time of day, because that relates to things like congestion and the like, and also other market negative externalities like pollution as well could be charged into that. But the ideal system is something that reflects the costs that are imposed on the system for two reasons. One is it's very valuable information so that we're able to plan maintenance and building of roads. But the other thing is, and the main bit is, it provides price signals to the users of the roads. When it's best for them to be using the roads. If you've got discretion, don't go in during peak times because you're imposing congestion on others. To the extent that toll roads, as opposed to fuel excise. So fuel excise is in one sense, it is an ersatz road pricing system, in that by and large you burn more fuel when you're driving more on roads, so you're paying more in excise. But it isn't hypothecated in any way, so there isn't a clear link between the money that's used, the money that's gained from excise and road building. And it doesn't feed through to local and state governments that are actually building the roads, because it goes to the federal government. Ultimately, that can pass through, but it isn't actually hypothecated. So that's why we're saying that fuel excise isn't a very efficient way of charging for roads. Toll roads, to the extent that they do, some of them have variable pricing for peak and off-peak, and variable pricing for heavy vehicles and light vehicles. Not exact, and it's not on, exactly on axle weight and the like, and those sort of things, things that technology would allow now. Because of the fuel, not on, exactly on axle weight and the like. They are slightly more reflective of the costs imposed on the system than fuel excise is.
Okay, I think we got that. I'm not sure if Hansard did, but just a bit garbled. But I appreciate that. So, would you be suggesting like the major road network would be a toll road network, and obviously rural, regional, and suburban roads wouldn't be, just to manage price signalling in those major roads, those major arterial highways and roads around our cities? I'm not just talking about Sydney. I'm just in general in terms of ACCC's view.
So more broadly, we think that there should be those sort of pricing signals on all roads. Issues of congestion and the like are more relevant to Sydney than they are to regional roads. So there'll be elements of those that aren't particularly applicable to non-urban roads. But the ideal system wouldn't discriminate between urban and regional roads in that sense. All of them would be priced.
All right, well, that brings me to what I think will be my last question in this round is you look at...
between urban and regional roads in that sense. All of them would be priced.
Okay, thank you. So talk about competition, and I'm not, and you've delved into the competition in regards to the marketplace tensions in terms of toll roads, but to be frank, there's a tension in Treasury and in government to deliver road upgrades, highway upgrades, a program replacing all the bridges in rural and regional New South Wales, non-tollable roads across the state, and infrastructure needed for Sydney to generate, remove congestion and generate economic growth in Sydney. So there's a competitive tension in the government to deliver both those at once. So I'm talking about competition for Treasury to deliver, for the government to deliver. So would you not see the delivery of infrastructure in the city paid for by basically city drivers that frees up capital, opportunity costs, frees up capital to rural and regional New South Wales, the Pacific Highway, Princess Highway, the Blue Mountains upgrade, right out through to rural and regional New South Wales as a good outcome, a good competitive outcome?
Although you used the word competition, and it's nice to say that the ACCC is responsible for competition issues, I think that form of competition in the way you use the word isn't really our domain, and that's really for New South Wales government making those priority decisions So I don't think we have a comment on that. Sorry.
Okay, good dodged. Okay, over to the chair.
Thank you. Just one last question from me. I've remembered what my earlier question was, and then I'll hand back to the opposition. Perhaps one for you, Mr. Leuner. When we were talking before about the market for bidding for future toll roads, and that this is the sort of market that was being looked at when considering Westconnex, is it ever considered, I guess, that the market for running toll roads and that involving government as an operator of toll roads as being, is that ever considered in whether there needs to be competition between, I guess, the government sector and the private sector, or are we dealing only with private sector entities?
So it's a good question, because obviously when the government is looking to sell a concession for a toll road, in the back of its mind, I assume, we're not privy to this, it's always thinking, well, if we don't get a good outcome, we can do it ourselves. The government's built many toll roads over the years, as you would be aware. So, but that form of competition, which is kind of a competition between in-housing it as government and selling it, isn't really the competition the ACCC is so concerned with. The ACCC is concerned about the future competition between bidders and, I guess, private sector bidders for roads in future. But it goes to it's a tricky question to answer, but it goes to that point that we do think the government is in the driver's seat here. It can control what it does with toll roads. It's the one issuing these concessions. So, yeah, for example, it could decide, not to privatise roads in future, and then there's no competitive harm from, or it can decide to even the playing field in whatever techniques it uses. So, in the back of our minds, the fact that the government is the one in the driver's seat for all these decisions was a factor in, if the government feels like Transurban is somehow, for want of a better word, giving, taxpayers a dud deal on these future concessions, it's in the driver's seat and can change that. So sort of indirectly relevant, I think, would be the answer.
Thank you. Back to the opposition, Mr. Graham.
Great. Thank you, Chair. I was glad that you raised that issue about the unsolicited proposals. We didn't have time to get to that in our questioning, but that was a very useful view that you put to the committee. I'm interested in your view about whether toll road extensions or variations really meet the key test that the government applies, which is uniqueness. The New South Wales government policy itself says the following is not a qualification for uniqueness. I quote, proposals for significant extensions / variations to existing contracts or leases, or the next stage of a stage project on the basis that the contractor is already on site. So that is not unique. Does that underline your concerns that these toll road extensions should be not the subject of unsolicited proposals, or if there is an unsolicited proposal, should be subject to competition?
I think our view is that the government should just attempt to put them to competition and a competitive tender process wherever it can. And I'm sure everyone's seen the examples that when you start getting towards the end of a concession, the toll road company typically puts a proposal to government, we'll add 2 lanes and we'll add some more off-ramps, or we'll extend a few kilometres, whatever it might be. And in return, give us another 20 years of concession. That's their unsolicited proposal in simple terms. And if the government always accepts those, we're just going to have this cycle where nothing is ever put to tender repeated, on an ongoing basis, because in another 20 years, who knows, we'll need more lanes or whatever it might be.
Yeah, so it's a very good point, because that will become more important now that many of the toll roads are planned or built or on the way to being built. That dynamic over the next decades will become more important.
Yeah. And so, for example, let's say there was a new road coming off an existing toll road. We see no reason as a general rule, there may be some legal reason we're not aware of, but why generally that couldn't be put to full tender and, you encourage a competitive bid process. For situations where they're adding lanes and things like that, look, we're not privy to whether that's legally possible to put that kind of thing to tender, but we would encourage governments to find whatever ways they can to even put those sort of things to tender. Perhaps you wait out the concession, and once the concession's over, the road's back in government hands, and then the government puts out a tender saying, okay, bidders, you have to add 2 lanes to this freeway, and then you'll get a concession for 10 years for doing that, and they run a tender on that basis. So I think there are ways you can encourage competition, even in those examples where it's an extension or an improvement to an existing toll road.
Yeah, no, thank you. And I might just finally put to you what I understand the committee will consider these carefully. What you're saying are some of the things the New South Wales government could do in this space in the view of the ACCC. Looking at your submission, looking at what you've told us today, these are some of the things the government could do. One, broader measures for the data that's required from toll road operators. 2, the government could apply those requests for that data to be public rather than leave it to the ACCC. 3, the time for tenders could be very important to the competitive tension. Where unsolicited proposals come in, 4thly, there should be some competition applied. And then 5thly, you've really said when it comes to decisions about privatisation or not privatising, those decisions should be considered carefully, and the terms of those privatisations should be considered carefully. Is that, as I've heard what you've said today, there are 5 things the government could do to get more competition, get a better result in New South Wales. Is that a fair summary of the views you've put to the committee?
I think it is, yes. I'll just check with Mr. McCracken-Hewson whether you think that covers the points from your end.
I think it does, yes, thank you.
And is there have you got a 6th point? Is there anything you want to add to that?
Well, I mean, there are other techniques, which we spoke briefly about underwriting bidding costs, which is another way.
Yeah.
You know, so they're big international toll road companies, and if you say, look, if you're the 2nd or 3rd ranked bidder, we'll, give you X million dollars to cover the costs of all your modelling and things like that. That'll encourage them to put in a bid and hopefully a competitive bid. That's the other one that could be tried.
Thank you.
Thank you. Unfortunately, that's all we have time for this particular session. Thank you so much for attending and for providing us with the benefit of your wisdom. The Secretariat will contact you in relation to any questions that were taken on notice and also in relation to any supplementary questions we may have. That concludes this session. We've got a half-hour break before we come back at 12 o'clock. Thank you all.
Thank you.
Let's get started. Welcome back. I now welcome our next witnesses. Could each witness please state their name and position title and swear either an oath or an affirmation? And I'll start with you, Mr. Head.
My name is Andrew Head. I am the CEO of Westconnex. I do not have a copy of the oath or affirmation.
We will get one for you.
Turn it off by heart.
You?
Oh, nearly. We make up one that sounded pretty good.
Sort of get there, right? You know.
The whole truth and nothing but the truth.
Yeah, that's something.
There you go.
The right to silence anything you say can and will be held against you.
Slightly different.
The affirmation.
Sorry, go ahead.
I solemnly, sincerely and truly declare and affirm that the evidence now about to be given by me shall be the truth, the whole truth and nothing but the truth.
Thank you very much, Mr. Head. And Ms. Huey.
Thank you, Chair. My name is Michelle Huey. I'm the Group Executive New South Wales for Transurban. I will take the information for the committee. I solemnly, sincerely and truly declare and affirm that the evidence now about to be given by me shall be the truth, the whole truth and nothing but the truth.
Thank you very much. Now, thank you. Before we start, I'd like to say thank you very much for your submission and for your additional documents which we received. Thank you very much. And thank you for appearing today. Did you want to make a short opening statement?
That would be great.
Please go ahead.
Thank you, Chair, and to the committee for our invitation to appear today. On behalf of Transurban and Westconnex, we would like to acknowledge the traditional owners of the land on which we meet and pay our respects to their elders past, present and emerging. Transurban appreciates the opportunity to have an open and transparent dialogue about Sydney's road tolling regimes with all sides of politics, to look at ways to deliver the best outcomes for everybody. Having commenced operations in Sydney in 2005, we have a long-term interest in the city's livability and prosperity. Since 2013, we, along with our partners, have invested $25 billion into Sydney's motorway network. This is money that would have otherwise come from government budgets, leaving less funds for other priorities such as health, education and public transport. The biggest benefit to motorists is through travel time savings and safer and more reliable journeys. Let's take Northconnex as the most recent example. This has not only provided a missing link between the M1 and the M2, allowing a traffic light-free journey between Newcastle and Melbourne, but it's transformed local communities. Since Northconnex opened just over 12 months ago, it has taken an average of more than 6,000 trucks off local roads. The drop in heavy vehicle traffic on previously congested corridors has seen the number of crashes more than halved on Pennant Hills Road and the number of near misses reduced by up to 65%. Drivers see the benefits. Prior to the COVID-19 pandemic, on average, almost 1 million trips a day were taken on our Sydney roads, saving users around 225,000 hours every workday. We have a case study in our submission which illustrates the productivity benefits and cost savings should businesses choose to use our roads. We show that if a freight company were to use the M5 motorway to transport goods between Port Botany and Ingleburn Industrial Precinct, they could save 34 minutes and avoid 49 sets of traffic lights, equating to $43 in value of travel time and around $22 in fuel savings. Even after factoring in the toll, there's a $29 net benefit. As the committee would be aware, tolling structures on individual roads themselves vary. They can be distance-based, they can be fixed, or variable by time of day. Transurban is open and willing to discuss the tolling structures themselves, as we have written in our submission. And to understand the bigger picture, Transurban commissioned KPMG to conduct a detailed economic analysis on the impact on toll roads. They estimated that Sydney's toll road network will create $35.8 billion in direct economic benefits over 30 years due to its accelerated delivery by the private sector. This will create 5,300 full-time jobs every year over 30 years. These are significant game-changing numbers for Sydney and we believe should form part of the consideration of this committee when examining the value and the impact of Sydney's toll roads. I would now like to hand over to my colleague Andrew Head, CEO of Westconnex, to address the committee.
Thank you.
Thank you to the committee for the opportunity to represent Westconnex today. Building motorways is difficult and it requires difficult decisions. Governments have to decide whether to raise taxes, to adopt a user pays model such as a toll road, or to not build them at all. The inquiry's terms of reference includes Westconnex. So why is Westconnex important? And why is it important to build motorways? Sydney drivers know the answer to this question. For decades, the M4 stopped at Parramatta Road at Strathfield, and the M5 East moved at a snail's pace in peak hour. Westconnex has already started to deliver benefits to bring relief. On the M4, a trip in the westbound direction can save up to 55 minutes today. There's also, most importantly, a third less traffic on Parramatta Road, and the air quality in the corridor is some 10 to 15% better. With the opening of the M8, the M5 East is also materially better, 60% faster and 40% safer. Westconnex is going to transform Sydney, and it needs to. In the next 10 years, 40% of Sydney's population will live within 5 kilometres of the Westconnex network. Westconnex, in combination with the other motorways, will form the spine of this city and make the motorways safer, faster and easier to get around the city. But the full benefits of Westconnex are yet to come, with the M4-M5 link and the Rozelle interchange opening around 2023, the benefits I just referred to are only going to compound. In addition to that, there will be 18 hectares of parkland put in place across Western Sydney, there will be 1 million trees planted, and there will be 23 kilometres of cycleway and pedestrian path put in place. Once Westconnex, most importantly with the other transport projects that are currently being constructed, are all complete, Sydney's mobility is going to be transformed. And it will give us as a city every chance to be one of the great global cities of this century. So Michelle and I thank you very much for the opportunity to appear today, and we're very happy to take any questions that you may have.
Thank you very much, and we'll start with the opposition.
Great. Thank you, Chair. John Graham for the opposition. Firstly, thank you for your submissions and your opening statements. They've been very helpful to the committee. In particular, you've really spelt out the benefits very clearly of these toll roads for the city. One of the things the committee is struggling with is the costs that drivers are paying. One of my frustrations is the government has simply not been upfront about the costs so we can weigh up the impact of these toll roads across the city. So I might start by asking you, how much are drivers paying in total, in tolls across Sydney, say for last financial year? How much are drivers paying on roads in which Transurban has a share?
Mr. Graham, in terms of the overall picture for Sydney, unfortunately we don't have visibility into some of the assets and the roads that we don't have involvement in. Yeah. But I think if I could answer your question by looking at the assets that Transurban does have responsibility for operating, for the financial year ended 2021, the revenue that Transurban collected was 1.28 billion. This information is publicly disclosed as part of our financial reporting. As to whether that actually answers your question, yeah. I think there are a few other factors that needs to be taken into account that completes the picture in terms of access to cashback, in terms to access to rebates, and that sits with the individual motorists, and so we don't have visibility into that. And when we think about the question that you have asked, revenue is one dimension. Yeah. The other one, of course, is all of the costs that are involved in both delivering it in terms of the capital, but then also the ongoing maintenance to make sure that these roads are safe and they deliver the value proposition that they do to the motorists.
And I accept all those things. There are benefits, they might be significant. There are costs that Transurban's got to bear, or other toll companies or other partners in these toll roads have to bear. But on the question of what are drivers paying, that's something that the public deserves to know. You've said 1.28 billion is flowing to Transurban. Obviously, you don't have a 100% share of a range of those assets. When you look at the total toll roads that Transurban has a share of, that figure's higher, isn't it? Isn't it closer to 1.961 million last financial year?
That's right. So if we consider also the
1.961 billion.
That's right. So if we consider the investments that our partners have also put in, our partners such as Australian Super, such as QIC, such as other partners that we have in all of the motorways, then the total number for the financial year just ended is 1.96 billion.
Yeah, so that doesn't all flow to Transurban, but in terms of what's coming out of drivers' pockets, in tolls across Sydney last financial year, where you had a share, it was $1.961 billion. On top of that, there's about $120 million paid on the Sydney Harbour Bridge or the Sydney Harbour Tunnel. Is that accords with your rough understanding? I know you're not responsible for those assets.
I wouldn't be able to answer that question accurately because I don't have visibility into that, but there will be others that may appear in front of the committee that could better address
and I think that's fundamentally reasonable, but you are confirming what you are aware of, 1.961 billion. On top of that, when you add the money that flows on the Sydney Harbour Bridge and the Sydney Harbour Tunnel, you'd agree, I'm telling you that's $120 million last financial year. That takes us over $2 billion in tolls paid by drivers last financial year across Sydney.
Yeah. And that's the context. In part of my opening address, we also want to think about then what do these motorways actually help us achieve? And in the KPMG analysis that that has been completed, KPMG looks at the direct economic benefits as a result of these motorways being delivered much earlier than they would otherwise have been, and the economic benefits that flow through, which over a 30-year period total in the order of 36 billion, comes in the form of travel time savings, which translates into productivity when it comes to businesses, operating cost expenses when it comes to how the roads are driven on, and then thinking about also direct...
And accepting those things, you've already said on Transurban roads, where you have a share, nearly 1 million trips a day. In fact, when you add on the other roads, we're now in Sydney, over 1 million trips a day, toll trips, that drivers are paying for. You'd agree with that?
Yeah, I think the numbers that I provided is pre-COVID, because I think everyone would recognise that the pandemic has put some very disruptive challenges into the whole Sydney. But in terms of that being a demonstration of the level of demand for our roads, and the motorists that make a choice on using our roads, seeing the value that they can get in whatever form, whether it's travel time savings, operating costs savings, fuel savings, or reduction in emissions, and however way the motorists make that decision.
Yeah, so can I just thank you for being much more upfront than the government has been on this question. No minister will let those numbers pass their lips. They've ducked and weaved over years, trying to avoid answering that simple question, how much are drivers paying? So I want to thank you for the evidence you've provided to the committee. Mr Head, I might ask you for Westconnex, what are those figures? Last financial year for Westconnex, how much did drivers pay in total over the financial year?
I can do better than that for you if you'd like. So Westconnex has been with assets charging tolls for the last 3 years, and it's a story as the pieces of Westconnex come together. So in FY19, the M4 was the only part that was charging tolls, was 158 million. In FY20, M4 only 280. And then in FY21 we had M4, M8 and M5 East, and we had 533. So the total is 971. But I want to make it really clear, and this is a very important point for us, that we are investing an enormous amount of capital to allow this to happen. So our operating costs, our maintenance provision, just bear with me for a moment, our interest costs and the amount of money that we've spent on construction exceeds the amount that I have just given you, the 971.
Yeah, and that's accepted in the short term, but I think you've filled in a key piece of the puzzle here. What are drivers paying in the past? So again, I thank you for that, Mr Head. Can you tell us perhaps what drivers will pay? Looking ahead, we know that more toll roads are coming online. Sydney will soon be ringed by up to 15 toll roads. Those toll prices are often increasing at 4% a year. How much will drivers pay looking ahead to the future? You want me to take that one?
So Michelle and I are able to be very transparent about what has happened behind us, because we work for a listed company and we provide all of this material to the ASX on a quarterly basis. The same dynamics challenge us in terms of being able to provide you with long-term forecasts. So we're a listed company, and the Corporations Act inhibits our ability to provide those long-term forecasts. And the reason for that is that people buy and sell shares based on the advice that our directors give in relation to guidance. So we can't predict the future, and the last 12 months has taught us that better than any of the last 12 months. And that is that, you know, with pandemics and lockdowns, the traffic dropped considerably. We've had other stories in Sydney, not well before Transurban was involved. The Cross City Tunnel went into receivership twice before it became part of the Transurban assets. The Lane Cove Tunnel went broke once. So our directors have an obligation under the Corporations Law to only provide a short amount of forecast, but we can't furnish you with a long-term forecast.
So, Mr Head, if I accept that premise, where would the committee look for forecasts about this question?
So, because of our ability to only provide a short-term forecast, the only place I can direct you towards would be the analysts who cover stocks like Transurban. The last time I checked, there must be 8 or 10 of those.
And would you be happy to take on notice if we asked you those analysts in particular who take an interest in Transurban, so the committee can further pursue that?
Look, all of those people are publicly known, and if you need Transurban to assist you in knowing who those people are and the organisations they work for, we'd be happy to provide it.
Thank you. You accept, though, or you don't disagree with this idea, it's in the public interest for drivers to know how much is actually being paid out. You don't object to that information being provided by the government that does have forecasts that, for instance, put forecasts in the data room as you bid to purchase these assets. You don't object to those, to the idea that that is in the public interest for drivers to have some idea of how much will be paid in tolls in the future.
Well, the base case financial model and all of the forecasts that we're referring to are provided in a summarised form, as I understand it, by the government. As I've said to you before, we at least, and I suspect others, are inhibited by the Corporations Law in relation to the provision of long-term forecasts. But we do, as I've said, and Michelle has made the point earlier, provide our quarterly results to the ASX. And the most important piece of material, and it goes to the essence of some of your questions, Mr. Graham, is the tolling regime is fully disclosed as part of the summary that the state puts out. And that is the piece that is fixed at that point, and it doesn't change regardless of who owns the assets. And I think that is probably one of the critical pieces of information that is available for people to determine what the price will be.
One of the things the committee's looking at is what are the prospects for toll relief for drivers. The concern that's been put to us in evidence is that costs are just becoming too high. You've said in your submission and in the opening statement that you're open and willing to discuss that. I might just ask you on that point is, how does that work? Have you got anything else to tell us about the fact that you would be open to a discussion about changing those contracts if it was judged to be in the interests of Sydney, if it was judged that those costs have simply become too high?
Absolutely, and the committee will be aware that all the concessions are effectively commercially and legally binding contracts, very similar to other contracts that may be in place for this industry and otherwise. And as Andrew mentioned, the contract set forth tolling regimes for the term of the contract and the concession. Having said all of that, as we said, Transurban has a long-term interest in Sydney's livability and prosperity. So if there are opportunities for us to explore how we can better deliver these benefits, and the government would like us to be part of that, we would absolutely appreciate the opportunity to have an open dialogue. But we would also recognise that these are very complex policy questions that need to be contemplated by policymakers, and so very happy to be part of that conversation if we have the opportunity.
There's been media reports of a Treasury review into the cost of tolling, media reports about the prospect of a real change to Sydney's tolling, perhaps a toll cap, distance-based tolling in place by Christmas. What discussions have you had direct with the government on toll relief or changes to the toll arrangements for Sydney?
We have not had any direct discussions with the government on that. This is obviously a topic of relevance and of interest to us, and we have engaged with stakeholders on both sides, all sides of politics, when we put together the submission to share the key messages out of them, and the committee will be aware that within that submission that we have made, we have mentioned, without repeating myself, that we are open to discussions should the government wish to engage in those dialogues with us.
So no discussions on that specific proposal, but no direct discussions with the government recently about toll relief or changes to the toll regime?
And these are all policy questions that really rest with the government, and the decisions remain with the government. We would be open to having a dialogue other than what has been shared in the submission. We haven't had any other direct engagement. We don't have any specific solutions that we are pushing for. We don't have the full visibility on the full policy context that these questions need to be considered.
So how would you assess, given there have been no discussions, how would you assess the chances of a Christmas present, toll relief for drivers in place in time for Christmas?
I think without putting repeating the message, I think these are really solely in the hands of the government to decide what they would like to do, and we haven't been engaged in what the change could be, what are the options, and what role we may or may not play in that.
Can I just follow up on that? Was the first time you were aware of the Treasury review was when those reports surfaced in the media?
In terms of the conversations around some of those,
Just the Treasury review that my colleague just made mention of.
I think we read the same articles in the media.
And that was the first time you became aware that the Treasury was undertaking a review into the tolling regime?
Other than sharing the key messages of submission, which includes being
Yeah.
open to the dialogue,
Yep.
we haven't engaged in any detailed discussions.
Okay, thank you. Can I just follow up on some of the points I think Ms. Huey, you made and Mr. Head made as well, particularly on the data aspect of it, which it's fair to say I have an interest in. You did disclose the revenue figures according. Do you have that broken down between cars and heavy vehicles, or our notice? Are you in a position to take that, or can you tell us now?
No, it's very standard practice. I apologise, Michelle.
You go ahead.
It's very standard practice for Transurban to disclose every quarter the revenue and the traffic by asset. And my recollection, and I just would like to double check this, is that we also provide the split between car and truck. Are you sure about that?
Yeah, so I think if we could come back to the committee
Yeah,
with
sure. Just
further
on
breakdown
notice.
of the revenue information, but certainly in the traffic data that we release on a quarterly basis that Andrew talked about, that traffic information includes all traffic volume, so not revenue volume, broken down into vehicle type, which is effectively Class A, Class B in Sydney, and the volume across every single gantry on assets that Transurban has an interest in on a 15-minute basis.
Thank you. On that, I was going to ask, just as a follow-up again to the line of questioning that my colleague was asking, the traffic, well, the revenue figures that you disclose obviously infer traffic volumes. Can you tell us about how traffic volumes have changed or grown on your assets since the tolls have come in? And I'm just particularly, I recall asking this to Duncan Gay back in the day. At the time that the road was settled, I think the EIS projected on Westconnex traffic growth of 3.9%, 4% per annum each year, every year. Are we seeing 4% growth in traffic volumes on your roads until, obviously, the effects of the pandemic? Was that the trend number?
Would you like me to answer in relation to Westconnex?
Yeah, if we could do Westconnex first, that would be great.
Okay, so the roads undertake what we call in the industry a thing called ramp up. So when you open up a new road like the M5 East Tunnel, you do expect a heightened level of growth. That's very normal as people realise that there's more road capacity. But it typically settles down in the sort of 1 through to 3%, depending on where you are in the concession, unless there's some other network enhancement or some widening that affects that. In relation to all of the Westconnex assets, it's fair to say that they were all still in ramp up before COVID hit us. So it had that sort of slightly higher level of growth than you would expect in a mature state. They did get hit pretty hard during the COVID lockdowns. As a general overarching statement, both the M4 and the M5 corridor, when everybody was at home, was off as much as 50% at some times. It has started to recover. So in relation to your question about mature traffic growth, we haven't got to a point where we can experience that yet.
What is it now? I accept your point that it's not in its mature.
We're still trying to catch up to the pre-COVID levels.
Yeah.
So I'm still calculating how far behind we are rather than how far in front we are, but we will get back. It does seem. But to give you a little bit more colour on your question, it's probably appropriate for me to hand to Michelle, who's got some of the more mature assets in the portfolio, and she can maybe make a comment about one of those.
If you could, that would be helpful.
Sure, and if we take the period between now and 2013, I think the committee would recognise that the motorway network at that time looks vastly different from what it looks like now. And since that time, and without repeating ourselves again, with the $25 billion of investment that Transurban and our partners have put into the network, what we have seen is the completion of some of the missing links. I mentioned Northconnex, but also in increasing the capacity of some of the existing corridors, such as the M2, the M5, to cater for the population growth and the transport needs of Sydney. And so over that period of time, what we have seen is investments continuing to go into the motorways, and some of the growth that we're seeing is supporting the population, the employment, the economic activities that we're seeing. I think Andrew has talked about the disruption that we have seen since March 2020 with the pandemic coming in, and at the peak of the lockdown, with the restrictions that have been in place, we were seeing traffic decline of 50-60% on specific roads. And Andrew shared some of the recovery that we're seeing in Westconnex and some of the other corridors. I think we're seeing some changes in that traffic as well. So I think even without the COVID pandemic impact, I think we're seeing Sydney-siders, for example, doing more on digital channels, doing more online shopping. And so the amount of freight activities, not just on motorways, but also on local roads.
I appreciate that.
We're seeing changes in the patterns.
Yeah, and of course, that's all. But I'm just wanting to get to a core of sort of, in the mature phase, on the mature assets like the M2, what is it, prior to the pandemic, what was the annual rate of volume growth in the M2, for example?
If I can take that on notice and come back to the
Sure.
committee with the details and breakdown so that I don't
Yeah, fair
provide
enough.
the wrong
That's
information.
a reasonable point.
Thank you. I'd like to start questions in relation to the administration fees that are charged for people who have either not registered for a toll or potentially their sorry, now I've forgotten what that e-toll recording thing's actually called. E-tag, thank you. Hasn't been picked up. You may be aware that there was quite a bit of evidence given in relation to these administrative costs. Were you following that at the time? Yeah, great. So just to clarify some of those points then, how do you calculate the amount of the administration fee for each of those notices?
Chair, if I can start with answering your question, that
Please.
we do not profit from any of the fees that we charge.
Wasn't my question.
Yeah, the fees are reflective of the cost that is incurred in administering the service and carrying out the activities. So some of the examples, for example, that we have would be the investment and also the upkeep of equipment that we need on the roadside in order for the vehicle to be detected and for the trip to be measured correctly. And then all of the systems and the processes that need to be in place in the back office to make sure that that process occurs, and then any support and administering and service that we need to provide to the customer in the back office as well. So the across all of the categories of fees, none of them we make money on,
Okay.
and that's required in the concessions and the contracts that we have. Our preference is for customers to not pay any fees at all, and in fact, we have put in a lot of effort and a lot of innovations to make sure that they are fee-free products for customers to choose
Can we just
from.
take a step back and unpick what's actually happens? So somebody drives through, they don't have an e-tag. What is the process that you need to go through? What are each of the, I guess, the cost points that then results in you having to charge an administrative fee? Can you talk us through each of those?
Sure, let me try and walk through that, and then, Chair, if we need to come back to the committee with further details, we're happy to provide that. The customer has a choice on whether they install a tag or not. And so for the vehicles that don't have a tag, when they come through at gantries, and every motorway is slightly different in terms of how they measure. There is cameras, videos, equipment, and readers that we need to install by the roadside to detect the vehicle. In this case, for example, reading a number plate or registration plate of the vehicle, measuring the size of it, the height and the length to make sure that the classification of the vehicle is in accordance with the tolling regime. And once that information...
Sorry, just to interrupt you. So you don't get that off of the registration plate, you get that off of the actual... The camera
vehicle that
works
is
out the
measured.
vehicle? Okay.
Correct.
Yep.
And so with that information, then it finds its way through the back office systems that we have to make sure that we, as an example, on a distance-based type tolling regime like the M7, we would have to make sure that that vehicle trip is matched on entry and exit of the motorway to make sure that we can...
So that's not done automatically? That's done...
It is done automatically at the
Done
system, but
automatically
it's
by the
measured
system?
at the entry gantry and then the exit gantry
From a
as well.
cost perspective, that's the system. The system is doing that.
Well,
That's
just a slight clarification to that, because it's quite a detailed question. If the number plate is not read accurately in an automated fashion, then we need to
Sure.
manually check it. So that's one
Okay,
of the
so there's a
processes.
small... Yep, okay, I understand.
That's right. So by majority, these processes and systems are automated, and then, as Andrew mentioned, there are circumstances, exception rather than the rule, that requires some level of intervention, whether it is inclement weather, so there's rain, there's fog, and stops the registration from being read accurately,
Yep.
or whether there's something, a glare or something else, or the nature of the vehicle that doesn't allow the system to process that automatically.
Can you estimate how many, I guess, hours or for each perhaps it's much more difficult to break it up between instances, but can you tell us, I guess, how many hours of employment you require for someone to do that exceptional kind of matching?
I think I would have to take that question on notice, Chair, and come back to the committee.
Okay, but there's possibly some staff time in
Chair,
there.
I think the one thing to add is that all of the processes that Michelle referred to, so the investment in the technology to make it automated,
Yep.
the plate read to match to the account, but also determining the length of it or the height of it, all of those things go into the cost process. And
Yep.
the most important point is that we are completely audited and checked on every single thing that you're asking about by Transport for New South Wales.
Sure, but the committee isn't aware. We're
Yeah,
trying
no,
to
but
break
I think
that
it's
down.
important for you to know that. So we are a very heavily regulated industry, and this is no exception. So Transport for New South Wales goes over all the questions that you're asking about
Yeah.
in very fine detail
With
to ensure that there are no
respect,
profit made from fees.
I'm asking these questions to get the answers, and I do appreciate you're trying to preempt where
Okay,
I'm
I
going,
apologise.
but I'm not going anywhere other than asking these questions in a quite systematic way. So we've got the camera time, the camera cost and the systems cost, the staff time. Then what happens if it's say the vehicle is actually registered to someone who does have an e-tag? Is that then dealt with separately to if you have to go? What's the process?
Yeah, and these are some of the, if you like, investments in technology that's now available, machine learning, analytics that allow us to actually automate what used to be manual processes to reduce the cost, reduce the, improve the efficiency. And so we've got systems that are able to do, perhaps not every single case, match some of those trips to the right account. In other cases where the matching does not happen, then in accordance with industry processes, then a toll notice is issued to the registration of the vehicle, the owner of that vehicle, and then there's a separate process that follows.
So, sorry, just to recap. So, do you have direct technological links, I guess, to the regos, so that you can to the registration database, so you can automatically do that, or do you need to? Is there a link with with RMS, I presume, that you need to go through? Is there an extra layer of onerous?
Let me try and answer the
Please.
question, and then you can let me know whether that
Yeah.
satisfies what you're looking for. In terms of the customers that we have responsibility for at a retail level, which is the tag account level that we're talking about, which is Link Sydney, then of course we have information of the customer, and we're able to, where we can, link the trip to the accounts that we have. When we're talking about customers that don't have an account at all, or they have an account that belongs to another retailer that is not associated with Transurban, then I think those are more interoperability related questions, processes that take place in the industry in the back office.
Okay, so that's the process, and then a notice is delivered, is sent out. Is that right? Is that an email or a letter, or how's that work?
In accordance with the industry practices that have been set down, I understand they're paper-based toll notices that are issued to the customer based on information through the government agencies.
Okay, so say I've gone through without an e-tag and I get charged $3.40 or something for a toll. How much is the admin fee then that I'm given on top of that?
I will need to come back to the committee to make sure, but my understanding of the first toll notice is $10, which is reflective of the cost that is then incurred to administer the toll notice
And if I
end
don't
to end.
pay that, how long do I have to pay that?
I'll have to come back to you with the
Okay.
details to make sure that
If a second toll notice needs to be issued, how much is that going to cost?
my understanding is
Customer.
the second toll notice is $20.
It's $20. Okay. So, and is that a reflection of it costing more at your end to produce? Because presumably all of that's already been done, all of that matching, we already know who this person is. So why is it $20 now?
So we don't make any profit out of any of the
I know
fees that we
you've said
incur.
that, yeah.
And the process itself from an end-to-end perspective is more than just the the vehicle detection of the trip, and also issuing of the notice itself. There are also a lot of processes that follow after that in terms of contacting the customer, providing customer service, collections, and all of those processes to make sure that from an end-to-end perspective, the fees reflect the costs that are incurred in operating that.
So I could be, for a $3.40 toll, I could then be up for $33.40 in charges plus toll to pay back, correct?
Yeah, and our preference is for customers to not incur
Obviously.
any fees at all,
Yeah.
and there are fee-free options that
Yes.
we proactively try and reach out to customers to see if that meets their needs. But we appreciate that the choice
Yeah.
is with the customer, and where we can, we would absolutely try and reduce the burden on customers.
Yeah. If I go into, and I have done this now a number of times, if I go into the system to see what unpaid tolls are due on a particular number plate, if I use taxi number plates and I go in every time I do it, I'll do 10 at random. There are always well above half that have unpaid tolls, and of those that then have administration fees on top of the unpaid tolls far in excess. Is that, first of all, can you explain how that can possibly be? What are the, you can just do that with it, sorry, I'm getting interjections here.
The privacy issue, I'll consider.
No, you can go in with any, it was something that we talked about in a previous hearing, but I can explain it to you later, Mr. Mallett. How is that happening? Why are people incurring such huge administration fees on top of their tolls and their taxi drivers? I don't understand.
Yeah, Chair, it's hard for me to comment on specifics, and I haven't personally looked, but I do understand that there are customers that are facing different situations. Our preference and always our focus is to make sure that there are fee-free options for customers. In fact, 95% of customers that use our roads travel without having to incur fees, and we hope that that number keeps growing. And that's the investments that we continue to make to make sure that we provide the best experience for customers, whether it is proactively notifying customers so that when they have travelled, that they are aware of the toll balance that is sitting with them before fees are incurred in terms of administering that. And one of the things that the industry-wide, so not just Transurban, have recently put in place with the coordination of Transport for New South Wales, as well as the Privacy Commissioner, so making sure that we meet all of the legislative requirements, is a process that is consistent across the industry that allows us to proactively reach out where the contact information is available to customer after the travel that they have made, rather than waiting until 10 trips have been incurred and 10 toll notices need to be issued.
And I think that's the other point here that we've heard a lot about. So if I've driven 10 times, so say and this is not an uncommon situation, say I'm in an abusive relationship and I have to get to work, but my partner has taken the e-tag. So I've driven 10 times and I've got $3.40 of unpaid tolls 10 times. I then end up with a bill after these administrative charges, and again, perhaps I don't have access to independent money. I suddenly have a bill then for 334 odd, because rather than combining each of these tolls into one toll notice, particularly after a period of time, you might think for the once you get to that second toll notice, unpaid toll notice, you might combine those, but instead we're still getting $20 for each second notice given. Has any effort been made to simplify that so that people aren't paying as much?
But let me try and then
No, I was just giving you
on
a
a bit
break.
of a roll. This is obviously a topic that both of us are really passionate about. We are absolutely cognizant of every customer's situation is unique, and where we can help, we support. I think, Chair, to the point that you have raised a question on, in our submission, we shared some of our thinking around how we can continue to improve that. And so one of the ideas that we have is around consolidating toll notices. So for For all the reasons that made sense at the time, the industry has a practice of issuing individual toll notices for every trip on every motorway. And so one of the examples that we have put forward, and we will continue to push as an industry, is can we actually look for opportunities to consolidate that? So it's not even just one toll notice per day, but it's a toll notice for, let's say, every 3 days. And then it would also consolidate across assets, despite the assets are owned by different partners, to allow from a customer's perspective a much easier, simpler and consolidated view that reduces the administration burden at the end.
Because you could, when you're looking at, administrative fees being 10 times the amount of the original toll potentially, you could do this for all of the roads owned by Transurban right now, couldn't you?
At the moment, these are industry-wide practices, and there are requirements that we need to meet in terms of as a concessionaire, in terms of how we issue toll notices that are limited to being individually issued.
Where is that limitation?
I'll come back to the committee with more information, but
Thank
our
you.
understanding is it's set forth in the concession. So as a concessionaire,
Yeah.
having an ownership of the asset, the processes and the requirements for how we issue toll notices.
I've seen the concession agreement for Northconnex, and it does refer to being able to charge administration costs for the actual cost, or the even the predicted cost. I think it is. It's an administration charge will be as reasonably determined by the project company in consultation with RMS, having regard to different casual user products that the company may wish to implement, the actual anticipated number of casual users, anticipated recovery rate of tolls and administration charges, blah, blah. I can't see anything in here that refers to having to do a single notice for every unpaid toll.
Yes, so that is an industry-wide practice, as Michelle said. And if there was something that could come out of this committee, we have been proposing to the industry, and that includes Transport for New South Wales for some time, a number of options to streamline. So if this committee can support us in making those changes, I think Transurban would be very supportive in relation to that. So just to reiterate, we would much prefer that customers pay no fees. This is not a story that is a good one for anybody. So anything we can do to streamline it, Transurban is ready, willing and able to engage to do so.
Because notably, there's nothing in this concession agreement that obliges you to act in any way to reduce the charges. Only it allows you to recover the direct and indirect costs to a reasonable approximation. Do you think that toll operators should be obliged to take steps to...
Well, in my experience when going through these discussions with Transport for New South Wales over the last few years, when they are looking at our fee structure to ensure that we are not doing anything other than covering our costs, they're always challenging us to determine whether or not we're doing it as efficiently as we possibly can. And with all of our other operations, we're always striving to do that.
The administration fees have been an issue for the Queensland arm of Transurban, haven't they? And I understand there was a class action, there's still a class action on foot in relation to the administration fees, is that correct?
My understanding is there is a matter that is before the courts. As it is a matter before the courts, I'm not sure if it would be appropriate for me to make much comments on that.
Understand. Obviously, we don't want a similar court action in New South Wales. When you refer, Mr. Head, to it's an industry-wide practice, given that you own 11 of the 12 toll roads in Sydney, you sort of are the industry. What do you mean when you say industry-wide practice, and how does that limit you in practical terms from taking action here?
The other big operator in the Sydney network when it comes to managing customers is Transport for New South Wales through e-toll. So Linked represents about half the market. Michelle will have the exact figures. So we need to come to a mutual agreement with Transport for New South Wales about a more efficient way to do this. And as I said earlier, we're ready, willing and able to engage with Transport for New South Wales to continue to push this sort of reform forward. So we have made some steps in relation to early notification reform. So we are wanting to get to customers as soon as possible, because oftentimes they've just made a mistake, or their e-tag wasn't beeping, or whatever it may be. We want to get that information into the hands of customers as early as possible so that we can rectify the problem. So, as I said, there is an opportunity to do this a little bit better, and we're happy to engage with Transport for New South Wales to do so.
Glad to hear it. Do you think, firstly, how many people do you pursue for unpaid tolls each year? How many individuals?
I think we'll have to come back to you on the details, Chair. But in terms of coming back to your earlier topic, in terms of people that do not have tags and travel on our roads, that's probably a single-digit percentage of the overall trips that are taken. And it very much reflects on the individual's choice on how they want to travel with or without a tag.
Yes. People do have other circumstances that make it so they can't always make the choice that they want to make. But if you could come back to me on notice then with how many people, individuals, that you pursue for unpaid tolls in each of perhaps the last financial year and the year before, that would be very helpful. And how many of those had a greater amount of administration fees payable than they had original unpaid tolls. And how many people do you pursue through the courts in relation to unpaid tolls? Do you have that figure?
We'll come back to the committee with some details. Obviously, we'll be limited at the level of information that we can share without breaking any privacy requirements. But I think the focus, Chair, that you have on that area is certainly an area that we are also very cognizant of. I think COVID has created some additional challenges and also sharpened the focus and the kind of support that we can provide. And so in terms of our well-established customer support program in Linked Assist, which is our brand, we have put in a lot of effort to make sure that where customers do have hardship, regardless of what the process says, we are in a position to provide some help. So take the last year and a half with COVID and the challenges that it has presented, we've been able to provide over $10 million of toll credits, and this is kind of up to 3 months of free travel on motorways to over 40,000 customers. They don't need to all be in hardship because every individual circumstance is different. At the time when the government was putting in place restrictions and lockdown, we were also making sure that the people that need to continue to travel, frontline workers, first responders, they are also eligible for the toll credit so that they can get to where they need to get to as quickly and safely. And beyond the financial support, we are also aware that a lot of people, whether it's domestic violence, whether it's mental health, there's a lot of other issues that face city-siders, and we can't solve all of those problems, but we do have partners such as organisations such as Good Shepherd that can provide other forms of help, such as housing support, food relief, mental health and domestic health support. And so we work very hard to make sure where we can, we provide the help, and where we can lean on some of the other partners, we create a holistic support that we can to customers that are in need.
Thank you. Over to the government members.
Thank you very much, Madam Chair, and thank you, Ms Huey and Mr Head, for appearing today. I just wanted to, look, starting from the beginning, I think that we all hate tolls and we all hate traffic. Yep, we all hate tolls, we all hate
capital
traffic. So they're the starting premises. But in terms of some of the case studies you've got in your submission, I think you go through some of the benefits that are provided in terms of the tolled routes that are available, that Transurban provide. So just going through that, so I'll turn to case study 2. This is an individual one travelling from Macquarie Park, close to me, to Blacktown. So the toll paid is $10.44 for that route. So that's going along the M2 and part of the M7, I take it, to go to Blacktown. And then the net benefit you have there outlined as $39.03. Just what's the basis of coming to that net benefit value?
Yeah, and as I mentioned, Mr. Farlow, the customer needs to judge, the motorist needs to judge what is important and how much value they put on, for example, their time, and also how much value they put on having a reliable journey, a safer journey, and also when they own and run a vehicle, operating costs, and if they're, for those that are sustainably minded, emissions. And so when we think about the benefits of motorways, there are many different aspects, and it's up to the motorist to decide what it is. In the case study that we have shared, the net benefit that we have shown here is a combination of those things. And so,
So
the
it's a
travel
combination
times,
of the individual benefit and a combination of the societal or emissions benefit.
absolutely,
or
in
like that.
terms of fuel savings, which also not just translates into what, how much someone pays for fuel, but also the impact on greenhouse gas emission. And so these cases that we have included in the submissions are examples of how motorists may see benefits across many different aspects. And then when we sum it up to the top, I think we've talked a bit about the KPMG economic analysis at a society level, the economic benefits that accrue to having the motorway network delivered in an accelerated fashion.
So along that route, for instance, there's a 37-minute time saving that you've assessed, and I take it this is pre-COVID as well, but has there been much of an impact in terms of the change of traffic conditions recently, but in terms of the benefit motorists are deriving from using the motorway network?
Yeah, so we mentioned earlier that pre-COVID, we were seeing around 1 million trips being taken on our roads in Sydney. And with that 1 million trips, the travel time savings per workday totaled 225,000. COVID has created some very disruptive patterns into all of our lives. But in terms of the travel time savings and what we are observing, it stays similar in terms of the travel time savings that motorists have been able to receive by using our motorways.
Okay. And just to turn to an example of a new road, for instance, so Northconnex. Have you seen, and I think you may have mentioned this somewhat, have you seen a reduction in the traffic on the arterial roads, so for instance Pennant Hills Road, because of the advent of Northconnex? Has that then created another benefit in terms of the saving for motorists who don't even use your toll road?
Yeah, and our primary focus is on our motorway and make sure that we operate them as safely, as reliably and efficiently as we can. And so in the case of Northconnex, we want to make sure that the motorists that use that road get the benefits and get the experience that they're looking for. As a result of putting that missing link in between M1 and M2, what we are seeing is changes to neighbouring roads, such as the one, Mr. Farlow, that you mentioned in Pennant Hills Road. So the average speed that we are seeing during peak hour that's travelled now mostly by local communities is also reducing. And I think in my opening address, I also mentioned it's not just the travel time, but also the number of near misses and crashes, which are really important safety considerations, considering that corridor includes schools and local community shops and businesses that need to or interact around there.
And just wanting to turn to some of the questions around freight that we've received during the inquiry as well. So I think in terms of the freight multiplier that is in place, I think it's about 4 times what a car would be paying on those motorways. Just in terms of, there were some criticisms from the freight industry about that multiplier. Can you just talk about perhaps how that is equated and sort of the benefits for freight as well, but also the cost impact of freight on the motorway network as well?
Yeah, thank you. I'll take that question, Mr. Farlow. Thanks, Mr. So there's a number of things that go into the development of a new motorway. When we start, we think most about the design of it. So we try to make them flatter, we try to make them wider, and we try to make them higher. And all of those things benefit the freight industry. When we assess, once the motorway is in situ, the wear and tear on the motorway, if you have a truck driving rather than a car, the wear and tear multiple that we apply is 5 times. That's probably a conservative number. I've seen numbers much higher than that, but they're heavier and they have an impact. And they do take up additional space. So as a general rule of thumb, we assume that a general sized truck is about 2.5 times the size of a car. So there are a number of elements that go into the assessment of a truck's impact on a road, and it results in that 3 times multiplier, which is often applied in Sydney. One of the other benefits that I don't think was discussed much in the earlier meetings of the inquiry is those benefits of taking additional trips, and I draw your attention to the examples that you were referring earlier. So on the example where we looked at the trip between Ingleburn and Port Botany, for instance, that trucking company that we referred to is making 14 trips between those 2 points rather than 9 if they had not used the toll road. And those benefits are accrued in addition to all of the things that are embedded within that example. So I work at Westconnex, I talk to truck drivers a lot, and I talk to them about hauling spoil out of the M4, M5 link, for instance. And when they can get an extra trip or 2 in each day, which they do when they're using the toll roads, they're able to charge somewhere between $400 and $700 a load. So from their perspective, speaking to the people that I speak to, they think it's a great outcome to take the toll road and to get those extra trips and get that extra revenue. And that's not taken into account in the example that we are articulating here.
Okay. That's good information for the committee. I also think when we're looking at the tolling arrangements here in this committee, and it's not just a committee that's critical, but a committee that is looking for what the solutions are for the future as well. So one of those, and I guess we've seen or heard during the committee, is some sort of comparison between the time it would take on a tolled route compared to the time it would take on an untolled route. Do you have any views on a proposal like that being initiated? I think it might have been in the NRMA submission or that, or could potentially, looking at your face, Ms. Huey, could even be in yours in terms of one of those sort of sign indicators saying what the difference would be in terms of the tolled route compared to the untolled route and perhaps the cost for that.
I'll try not to get too excited about the investments and the efforts that our team have put into this. Where we started, we want to make sure that the motorists have a choice and they have the best, accurate and most up-to-date information to make that choice for themselves, depending on where they value their time, where they value their trip. And so one of the things that we actually developed and using independent data such as Google and TomTom is a tool called Trip Compare. This is a tool that is online, it's readily available, anybody can use it. All you need to do is the user needs to put in an origin and a destination, and the tool provides options in terms of routes, both tolled and untolled. It provides the information based on the most up-to-date traffic conditions in terms of the travel time each of the routes would require, and also from our perspective, the fuel savings or the fuel consumption comparison of each of the routes, and then for the sustainably minded, also the emissions as a result of travelling either through a traffic light-free motorway or a more arterial type road. And that tool has been in operations. It's something that is available to anyone, not just customers of Transurban. I think what we are also continuing to invest in and listening to our customer and making sure that we do what the customers are expecting is some people may not want to use online tools, in which case we're looking at options that are physical signs that are erected at points on the road, just as the customer or the motorist need to make a decision on which path to take. In Melbourne, we are trialling what we call a decision point signage, which is a physical sign that shows different paths that a motorist can take and the average travel time. And so all that information up to date is in front of the customer for them to make that choice for themselves.
So if you're embarking on that decision, you effectively are backing yourselves effectively in terms of the benefit you provide to consumers and the motoring public, that they will be able to choose to go on the motorway. And I imagine there are times as well where it probably is not in your best interest to have people on the motorway either and to choose arterial roads because it would actually further impact that motorway.
Yes.
Yeah. And just thinking about that in terms of motorist information at the moment, like probably now more than ever motorists have a greater set of tools. There's the tool that you talked about, but there's also, Google Maps will allow you to choose a tolled or untolled route as well in determining which way you may go. And I know that, and Mr. Mallard was just remarking to me quickly that his car does it, and there'll be times when you'll be driving along the GPS and it'll show you 10 minutes more if you go the untolled route, stay on the route you're on. It doesn't necessarily tell you the price, but have you seen any dip in terms of motorists using your motorways because of that sort of information at all, or has there been that sort of continued growth? And of course, COVID is a challenge to encounter when you're coming up with those sort of equations.
I think we come back to the value proposition and our primary focus, which is to make sure that the motorways that we have responsibility for operate in the most safe and efficient manner, and we make sure that the customers have the choice to make. We actually don't hide any information. We want the customer to make that choice, because on the flip side, if they don't have the information and assume that the motorway is the better route that they take and they find that the experience doesn't actually work, it doesn't help them become a repeat customer of ours. And as I mentioned, we have a long-term interest in Sydney, and so making sure that the customers get the experience and get the value out of the motorways is a really important thing, and we continue to focus on that.
Thank you.
8 minutes. Goodness. Limber up for that.
I can tag back in if you want.
Thank you. Well, thank you for coming in today, and thank you for your a very detailed submission, very informative submission. I appreciate that. There was a little bit of banter, a little laughter before about we all hate tollways, but I'm a little bit older than my colleague, and having driven from Penrith to when I worked for Fairfax in the late 80s, early 90s, I recognise that the tollways, once they were built, really brought infrastructure forward that government just couldn't afford to build. I mean, you just rode down the Great Western Highway, down Parramatta Road, you crawled into the city. It was just shocking. And as the different motorways opened, and so I recognise, and I think consumers recognise, that there's a benefit from the toll in terms of infrastructure that's been brought forward. So I want to go down that line of discussion with you in terms of your submission. The section 2 talks about the benefits of PPPs. And I note in section 3 you've helpfully given us a list of, I assume that the 8 toll roads you've listed are ones that Transurban run, Sydney Harbour Tunnel through to Northconnex on page 26, section 3. But 5 of the 8 were commissioned by Labor, and that's the point I want to make. You know, both sides of politics have acknowledged the benefit of private capital bringing forward infrastructure. So do you want to package the issue of private capital coming into the marketplace to bring forward infrastructure and what opportunity costs it releases for government?
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Mallard. So having been in this industry for a little while, I used to look very closely at the cost of congestion figure that's issued by the Bureau of Infrastructure, Transport and Regional Economics. This year, it is $10 billion. If we hadn't have made all of those investments that you refer to and accessed the private capital, it would have been a lot higher than that, and it has been higher than that in the past. So the benefits that you describe are real, and they're accruing to individuals, people who work in the freight industry, people who are getting personal benefits, and the wider economy. The wider economy is a beneficiary of 5,300 extra jobs as a consequence of that investment. The average time that's saved every single workday in this city, every single workday, is 225,000 hours. In addition to that, to your question specifically, the proceeds from asset sales, such as Westconnex, and also the development of private toll roads using private finance has freed up the balance sheet to do other things. And Transurban is really excited about the fact that the Sydney Metro is being built, that there are light rails being built, that the federal government is making an investment in the airport, because all of these things are going to combine alongside the motorways that we're invested in and the public road network to enable people to move around this city and to enable those benefits that I've just mentioned, the $36 billion worth of benefits that will accrue over the next 30 years, to come to fruition. So we are proponents of the private financing model. It's applicable for motorways, and as you rightly point out, we have had good partnership, and many of our competitors have had good partnerships with all sides of government in delivering this infrastructure for the betterment of Sydney citizens.
Your the submission points to an estimated $52 billion of investment over the past 10 years from the private sector into the road infrastructure.
I have a different number in my head, so and it's slightly updated because of the recent 49% sale of Westconnex.
I think this is Australia, so that might not...
Oh, okay, yeah. So look, in Sydney, since the Sydney Harbour Tunnel, the private sector has put $35 billion into the Sydney motorway network. And that's $35 billion that the government might have put in if they wanted to build it on their own balance sheet. And, you know, we can all speculate on what other services, police, hospitals, schools, regional roads, that may not have received investment as a consequence.
Our colleague Sam Farray, who was online, has had to go to another inquiry now, but if he was here, he would be pushing then the rural regional benefits. So while city motorists are paying tolls for infrastructure brought forward through ahead of time, if it frees up the balance sheet to do things like replace all the wooden bridges in rural New South Wales, which benefits the economy of rural New South Wales, because heavier trucks and trucks without weight restrictions can get across bridges, you know, going to market and help our farmers. So the toll regime is not just benefiting city people, it's the whole economic opportunities across the state. in the balance sheet.
And
Well,
we,
as
we
I s-
don't envy policymakers having to juggle the many priorities and competing priorities. In our submission, and some of these numbers, as Andrew mentioned, have been updated since the time of that time of writing. We put in some of the examples with the help of the independent research that KPMG has completed, in place of the $13 billion of investment that private capital, in this case Transurban and our partners, have put in. There is a list of, if you like, a menu of other investments that would otherwise have been made in terms of regional schools, regional hospitals, or even public transport in terms of rail and investments in that. So we absolutely don't envy the policymakers needing to make those decisions, but we do see a role in private capital
Yeah.
and accelerating
Well, I
the
think
delivery.
both sides of politics do judge by that table of infrastructure you've listed there with the Labor governments. 5 out of 8 of them were commissioned by Labor governments, so it's not... both sides of politics clearly see a benefit of bringing in private capital to the infrastructure market in terms of roads. My second thing is, Mr. Head, you said sale of before, and I know that's the technical term, I guess the share market term you use, but when I was door knocking on Poles and Wires election, which we won, ALP opposed, some people, elderly people would say to me, oh, you're selling off Poles and Wires. And I'd say, well, no, we're leasing them. Your grandchildren can make a decision about the future of them because they'll be back in government's hands to deal with it. These are all leased assets, aren't they? And
No, you're absolutely right.
stay on the public asset list.
You're absolutely right, Mr. Mallard. The concession for Westconnex will be in the custodianship of the owners of Westconnex, the private owners, until 2060, and then it will be returned to the state. So I apologise for my language.
No, that's okay, but that's a public perception. So a whole lot of different
you're
assets will
absolutely
come back to, potentially back to public ownership at different points in that.
That's correct.
And legislators, maybe Mr. Farlow's son or daughter, will be making that decision in government at some time in the future about either, negotiating a future for those assets and expanding them.
That is correct.
So they stay in public ownership. And
Yes.
the state's public ownership is boomed, isn't it?
To the state's net worth, yeah.
Net worth has gone right up. Well, I appreciate that. Yes, of course. Yes.
Just to go back to that point of the $35 billion, it's not just in effect a $35 billion which is replacing other spending. It's not that the government doesn't spend that money. The government spends the money on health, education facilities, a range of other areas of infrastructure, but that $35 billion is then additional private sector capital which comes into the market which wouldn't be there otherwise, and therefore creates extra jobs in the market. It creates further opportunities for business in New South Wales.
Yeah. So what I said in the opening statement was that governments have to make difficult decisions. They either raise taxes to pay for these assets, they adopt a user pays model, and to your point, if you do that, then the capital comes from the private sector, and then the benefits that we refer to in the KPMG report are generated, or you do nothing. Now, if you do nothing, those benefits that we refer to would not be created, because you would have additional congestion and you would have less ability to move around the city, and all of the travel time savings and all the environmental benefits and all the other things that Michelle has spoken to would not be available, and we would be back to where Mr. Mallard was talking about, coming in from Penrith pre the motorways.
Yeah. I feel I have to ask you, in your opening statement, you said Westconnex will be opening in 2023. Why is it taking so long?
Well, it's a massive undertaking. So there's
The final leg, I mean.
There's $16 billion of construction underway. There are some 40,000 people who have worked on that project, and I can assure you that they are working tirelessly, and almost all the way through COVID. They managed to work through. They're very passionate about building those assets and getting them delivered for the people of Sydney as quickly as possible. We're reasonably confident that we'll get the first limb, the M4, M5 link, open in the early part of 23, I hope, subject to no further lockdowns. And then the Roselle interchange is the latter part of 23, perhaps into 24, depending on how progress goes.
I'm very keen to see it completed.
Okay, back to the opposition.
Right, thank you, Chair. I might pick up from where my colleague Mr Farlow was heading, and that's the question about freight use of these toll roads. The committee has had strong evidence about the from toll road operators, both evidence about one of the biggest toll road operators and independent small operators, saying the costs of the toll roads outweigh the benefit of using them for them. Now, you don't set the costs. That's in the government's hands. But what do you say to those freight operators who are making that decision and driving on suburban streets rather than on your toll roads?
Well, maybe I can start, and then Michelle can perhaps talk about Northconnex if it's required. What we say to the industry is that the M5 East today is 60% faster and it's 40% safer. My job and Michelle's job is to make those statistics and facts available to the trucking industry. And I go back to the point that is based on a conversation I had on site just a few days ago. The trucks that are removing spoil from Westconnex around Rozelle are taken out to Sydney Airport. Most of the ones I speak to are using the toll roads, and they're getting extra trips in each day as a consequence of that. And so with each trip they take, it's an additional somewhere between $400 and $700 of revenue that they're earning. So,
but you're right to raise the M5 East, because that's where a particular problem is. These trucks aren't on those toll roads. They're on Stony Creek Road, they're on Forest Road, they're on suburban streets, putting small businesses out of business at the moment. Why is that? Is that a result of the prices being wrong? That's the view that's been put to us.
well, my responsibility is Westconnex, and I've articulated the benefits as a consequence of building the M8 next door to the M5 East. And we will continue to tell and inform the trucking industry about the benefits that are going to accrue further. With the opening of the M4, M5 link, the connectivity between the M8 across to Rozelle is going to be outstanding. To be able to get from Rozelle to Sydney Airport in less than 10 minutes is going to change not only trucking companies' lives, but a lot of citizens in New South Wales.
And as you open that link, what are you, knowing what you know now about traffic on the other bits of Westconnex, what are you projecting the average daily traffic will be on that M4, M5 link as it opens in 2023?
First of all, we are expecting probably more of the trips that are currently taking the M5 East to drift across to the M8, because at the moment the M8 largely terminates at St Peters Interchange, so the connection in there will bring the Westconnex network together. To the amount of traffic, the M4, M5 link and the Rozelle Interchange is probably a lower trafficked section of Westconnex. As I mentioned in the earlier evidence given, the overall value of the M4, M5 link and Rozelle together represents about 15% of Westconnex's total value. So that gives you some sort of sense. You can kind of back solve based on what you're seeing in terms of traffic on the M5 and the M4 today. But the most important thing about the M4, M5 link and the Rozelle Interchange is it does provide that connectivity across the inner west. It provides an alternative route to the Eastern Distributor and Southern Cross Drive. And the capacity that we're building in those tunnels will enable us to cater for future growth over a very long period of time, not just during the concession of Westconnex, but when it's returned to government.
Staying with the question about freight, we know that these tolls are going to double or triple over the coming decades. That's not your decision, that's the government's decision. But for trucks, already on Northconnex, M2, the M4 under some conditions, the M7 under some conditions, truck tolls are over $25 already. What is your view about the impact that has, double or tripling those tolls under these concessions over decades, on owner-drivers, small business owners, some of these truck drivers?
And Mr. Graham, as you pointed out, the tolling regimes are set at the start of the concessions and they remain unchanged for the term. I think we also talked about, from an economic benefit perspective, the freight sector and the heavy vehicle sector is a key recipient of the benefits of motorways. We talked about the different aspects, whether it's in travel time savings, which converts into productivity, whether it is in the reduced wear and tear of the vehicles which are needed for running the businesses, because there's, in our submission and also other sources, there's a lot of analysis that has been undertaken and understanding and comparing what happens to a vehicle and the operating cost of a vehicle, let's say per kilometre, in a traffic light-free, no stop-start type scenario compared to a more a travel route that is more akin to an arterial or local traffic route, and you see substantial reduction in vehicle costs in those
companies,
cases.
these drivers know those benefits and disadvantages. They make that decision every day, and they're not on your roads. Are you comfortable that the price the government has set is the right one, given it's sending these trucks onto suburban streets?
So I'll trace my way back to the comments, Mr. Graham, that you've made. Tolling is a matter for government, so I'm not proposing to speak on behalf of anyone. In terms of the value, I think coming back to one of the points that we raised earlier with the committee is the importance of choice. And we want to make sure that whether it's an individual traveller or whether it's a business, they have a choice and they're armed with the most accurate information in making that choice. We don't have visibility into how individual businesses gauge operating costs, fuel savings, emissions. All of those are really important things for both the business as well as the broader society. And so what we focus on is making sure, as Andrew mentioned, that the information is available for people to make that choice for themselves.
Turning to toll relief and the linked data you provide to government, that information is provided in great detail to government. The government agencies have been clear about that. It's used to calculate daily for drivers how many tolls they've paid and whether they're eligible for toll relief. Can you just tell us exactly what information you're providing to government and give us some background on that question?
Okay. So in terms of the toll relief program, which is a government-led program, as a toll operator, we provide information around trips and around the value of those trips to the government in order for them to carry out the processes. As to how the relief is...
you're providing about half that data through Linked, the other half is coming from the e-toll.
So Sydney market is 54% linked.
Yep.
I think e-toll, which is the government, is 41%, and then the balance is made up of operators from other states.
Right.
So the lion's share of the information that is being provided is either coming from Linked or is already in the possession of Transport for New South Wales, and that's informing the data that you can see on the website.
So you have the majority of that information, but you don't have all of it.
No,
the government does have all of that information when it comes to knowing what drivers are paying, where they're paying it, how much is actually being paid.
That's probably a question that's
It's probably
better
best put
answered
to
by the
them
agency.
about how much they've got, and the richness of their data in relation to their own customers, the e-toll, is obviously going to be far deeper than what we provide. We just provide them with what they've required us to provide in order to calculate the toll relief.
Thank you. I might, I'll turn to your submission, page 23, that regional analysis, and thank you for providing that information again. More detailed information than the government has sometimes provided. It shows that much of the toll burden falls in northwest Sydney and southwest Sydney and the west of Sydney, unsurprisingly. It shows that in the northwest of commercial customers, more than 17% are paying more than $100. In the west, 23%. In the southwest, 19%. How high are some of those commercial toll bills? I've seen toll bills of $10,000 for some of these businesses, including on the M5 East, which was once free before the government changed that arrangement. How high? That's a lot of customers paying more than $100. How high are these toll bills?
Yeah, and perhaps we can start with prefacing for the committee's clarification that this information is based on our linked data, so by no means reflect the whole of the Sydney travellers. In terms of the breakdown by geography, once again, that's also based on the information that our customers have shared with us in terms of where they live. We don't have any information around where they travel to, what the purpose of the travel, whether it's for commercial purposes or for personal trips. So if I could preface that before I answer the question for the committee. And I think we talked through a bit of the average spend before. In terms of business accounts, and once again, these are accounts that are classified as commercial according to our customer database. We don't have complete visibility into every single one of the trips and the purpose of them. The top 1% that you were asking about, Mr. Graham, the average is around 4,600. And I'm cautious that when I give that information, we're talking about a very small number of customers. So I'm also aware and not wanting to tread into areas that may impact privacy requirements.
Thank you.
I just want to do a combination of picking up a few of the points that some other colleagues have made, just ask some follow-up questions. Can I just start with the M4, M5 link? I accept your point, Mr. Head, that it integrates or creates a network effect, really. Does that induce any further demand from local roads to move into the network? And if so, do you have a quantum?
My recollection, and it is a little hazy, it comes from 2018, when the first public disclosure was made in relation to Transurban investing in Westconnex, was that about that time, 16% of the overall value, I said 15 earlier, was coming out of stage 3, which is the M4 and the M5 link, and 10% of that 16 or thereabouts was actually trips that were already taking place on the M8 or the M4, but going longer.
Yeah.
So the best example is, at the moment, you can go through the M4 East and you get out at Haberfield near the Bunnings there. You'll be able to come all the way into Anzac and hop off there and go into the city, and that would be a longer trip. And therefore, I guess you could assume, or I could answer your question as that is a part of induced demand. I would say it's actually servicing the customer better because that's where they want to go and we're providing the infrastructure.
Yeah, of course, and like it's more a case of what do you think is we should expect, and I'm inferring, unless I'm wrong, that you think perhaps half of the users will be 8% of the users. If you said 16%, half of them, which you said were coming from existing roads, were just travelling longer on it.
Yeah, I mean, look, we're having a pretty broad, high-level kind of discussion in relation to this matter, but for the principle,
equally, I'm asking equally because the original Westconnex design had you going to Port Botany, and that's now the airport gateway section is now out and being built through a separate model. And what effect would the airport gateway be having on Westconnex? What do you expect it to do?
It's not a material amount. I'll have to take it on notice, and I'm not sure whether Transurban has actually disclosed.
But surely the trucks that are coming up, the M5 especially, certainly the use case for the airport gateway is to capture the traffic that's coming off the M5 East and directly connect them to the port, well, not directly connect, but take them closer to the port. And then the reverse movement is such that you would expect as well that certainly on the truck side, Westconnex will get more truck traffic as a result of the airport gateway return trips.
Well, I'm not so sure about that. And obviously we have to wait and see. But at the moment, those vehicles are travelling through the M5 East to get to the port. They now have two options.
Yeah.
And the traffic may redistribute. So cars may choose to use the M8 and the gateway into the airport because they're going to the airport. Trucks may choose to use one of those two routes. I'm not 100% sure which way it'll settle at this stage, but
fair enough. Look, it's fair. It's a reasonable point. If they're already using it, it's fine. But the I could be cute and make the point that, if, according to the logic of the government, that should be a tolled road. Otherwise, we're displacing schools and hospitals by building it. But I'll move on. What I did want to
policy announcement on the run from it.
I wanted to return to the question of toll relief, which is the options that are being explored. Some of the options which have been advanced in this committee by others, and namely infrastructure partnerships. I'm not sure if you had the opportunity to see their submission or peruse their evidence, but they were making the point that they'd like to see a whole of network approach adopt on pricing, equally time of day variation as well. Can you take us through what the implications of that are for the roads that you either operate or control?
maybe I'll make an opening statement and then Michelle can add to it. What Transurban has said is that we're willing to engage with the Parliament or whoever it may be within the government about potential reform. There are a multitude of options that are available, some of which were articulated by IPA, some were articulated by others. What Michelle said earlier is that we haven't really engaged with anybody formally yet, and so we're looking for a little bit of guidance about what the Parliament might like to have a discussion about. And then we'll probably do a little bit more work and be much more able to answer some of the questions that you're asking around the impact of time of day, versus making it all distance-based or whatever
I
it
do
may be.
appreciate it. That I guess I'm asking you, like, what would be sort of the first principles approach from Transurban as to which of these are most likely the most feasible and the most easy and the most practicable and the easiest to deliver? Because I guess all governments of all persuasions would seek your advice and input on this anyway. Which ones of these do you see as being feasible, practicable and relatively fast to deliver?
I think policy questions of this nature is really complex, and I wouldn't want to give you a short, sharp answer that without considering all the factors that need to be taken into account. I think coming back to the first principle, we support good transport policy, not just for motorways. We know motorways is a part of a broader road network, and for motorways to work, all the other roads need to work as well, and the broader transport as well, public transport, all the other modes need to also be coordinated, and that's part of the attractiveness of Sydney as a city having that integrated transport. The things that Transurban does support is a user pays model. So motorways in itself is a user pays model, as long as the information is available for motorists to make that decision whether they want to use and whether they want to pay. And so that as a starting point is something that we would support. As Andrew mentioned, there are many, many different options, and it very much depends on what the objectives are. We've talked about in our submission that the network of motorways that we have in Sydney now that serve us well has grown over 30 years. And so those concessions and the tolling regimes that were set in place at the time made sense at the time, met the purpose of the government of the day. But when we look forward, as the city grows and the population grows and the freight task demands increase, there's an opportunity for us to take a look, not just at individual assets, individual concessions, but look at this network as a network holistically. And what that means may be opportunities for us to bring greater consistency, greater simplicity for the customer, so they don't need to work out which road is distance-based, which road vary by time of day, and they can actually get a broader and more consistent experience out of that. And of course, something that is very important for policymakers would be around equity and fairness and how we try and look for opportunities to do that. In terms of implementation, that once again, depending on what the options are that we are considering, the implementation factors also need to be taken into account at the most pragmatic level, and we covered a bit of that when we were talking about fees and administration. What kind of roadside equipment is required? So take an example, currently we have motorways that are fixed cost in terms of regardless of how much distance a motorist travels, and we have others that are distance-based by kilometre. And so making sure that whatever model we go to, that the roadside equipment allows the tolling regime to be implemented is an important part. And then of course in the back office, making sure the processing is efficient so that we don't have friction, we don't have a burden for the customers in terms of the tolling and the customer service. That's also another important consideration. So I think my very long-winded answer is it depends on what the policy objectives are, what the options are, and we are absolutely appreciating the opportunity, and this inquiry is the very first step of that, to have those dialogues so that we can help in whatever way we can.
Thank you. I will just finish off on that discussion then in relation to the sort of road user charge model, which I understand that Transurban has been a big proponent of for some years. Is that correct?
So I think, Chair, the topic of road user charging, I think we pick up as a user pays concept, which Transurban absolutely support, by the fact that we run motorways that are user pays. It is a...
Sorry, I mean the broader...
Yep.
Sort of the entire network, basically, as you referred just previously to looking at options around the entire network. So specifically, I'm talking about the concept of having every car, regardless of what kind of car, paying per kilometre on our roads.
Yeah, and the reason for my response is motorways form a broader part of the transport network. The funding sources of that broader transport network, trotting out of my area of responsibility, such as fuel excise, such as registration revenue that's collected, do not cover toll roads. But we do have a vested interest in making sure that all roads are funded in a viable way so that they can meet the safety and efficiency and effectiveness objectives. Otherwise, our roads don't connect to anything that works. And so we do have a vested interest in that. And that's why we do want to, where we can, share our perspective on that.
But as Mr. Head said, you are you are a listed company. As a company, your kind of reason for being is to make profit. Obviously, there is a great opportunity for Transurban to be appointed as an administrator of the sort of grand road user charge scheme. Is that not something you'd be interested in?
I think that's another. Our answer would be similar to the answer around what are the policies and what are the options, because these are road user charging is a policy question that rests with the government, and so we haven't had any engagement, we haven't had any dialogue to know whether there is at all a role for anyone to play.
But that is as something that you have proposed many years ago as an entity. Presumably, it was proposed with an eye to profit.
Well, I think the proposal is first coming back to making sure that the rest of the road network works really well and has a viable funding option so that Motorways can connect into that broader transport system. In 2018, Transurban undertook on its own initiative a road user study to understand how a user pays model is understood. And so in that study, and I personally ran that 5 years ago, involved over 1,600 participants, voluntary participants in Melbourne, exploring different types of user pay models. And out of that study, which took about 18 months to complete, what we realised, and some of the perspectives we also shared with the wider industry and policymakers that are interested, is there's some work that we need to do as an industry, as a network, to help build a level of awareness and understanding around how roads are funded and built, and then what are some of the opportunities and options for us to create greater fairness, greater equity in how that funding
just
is done.
stop you there? A lot of your answer is very, if I may say, sort of designed for perhaps this audience. If you could pretend for a minute that I'm a business analyst and tell me what's in it for Transurban when proposing a broader road user charge. Where's the profit coming from that in your eyes?
My answer is still going to be the same, because
I don't think we're proposing anything. We're waiting to see if anything is proposed, if there is any change, and if anything is proposed, then I guess we would say to the business analyst, we'll assess it when it's proposed and see whether there's anything that we could do to play a role.
But Transurban did propose a road user charge back in 2015, I believe it was.
Well, we undertook the study.
Yeah.
And we provided the output of that study, the data, into the policy environment, but ultimately it's a decision for government to decide what to do with it.
Is part of the potential negotiation around changing the structure of tolls in Sydney, is part of that also a bit of a beginning of a negotiation around having that broader road user charge that Transurban could then play a role in?
No, not that I'm aware of.
anything else on that topic would be speculation on our behalf, because we haven't had any engagement.
Could I ask, does Transurban make political donations?
We do not. We have a policy that prohibits us from making any political donations.
And how long has that policy been in place?
I will need to come back to the committee, but for as long as I have been.
The Greens don't take to corporate donations. Thank you, Mr. Mookie. I have some records here that show that in the last 5 years, Transurban has donated almost $1 million to the Liberal Party, including the Cormac Foundation, which is a Liberal Party fundraising entity. How does that meet the statement that you've just made?
Yep, so our Transurban policy prohibits direct political donations. Common practice to the industry and also businesses, we do look for opportunities to attend events or forums when there are topics that are relevant to our business, and where there are opportunities for us to engage with stakeholders, not just government, but also industry and wider, on these very important topics and topics of interest from time to time.
So $1 million worth of event tickets?
Yeah,
No, I'm
all
talking
that,
about Australia-wide.
All of that information is disclosed in line with the Electoral Commission requirements. For financial year 21, I understand the number related to attending some of these events in Australia was $99,000, and none of it was in New South Wales.
I just
No, that's right.
Perhaps this might be a point of clarification that can help. My understanding is the Cormac Foundation is an investment fund, and they may well have invested in Transurban shares rather than Transurban making a donation to them. So
It's disclosed as a donation on the register.
okay, well we can take that on notice. But,
to a associated entity of the Liberal Party.
okay.
If you could take that on notice, that would be great. Let me know how much has been donated this year. But wouldn't you agree that's a little bit of a misleading statement to say that you don't make political donations?
I think
Clearly, you do make political donations because they're disclosed on the AEC website.
Our policy prohibits direct political donations, so the expenses that we incur in attending forums and events, we disclose in line with the Electoral Commission requirements, and these are made publicly available.
As a company that has its reason for being to make profit for shareholders, what do your shareholders expect from the return? What is the return expected from those political donations? What is it that Transurban gets from those political donations?
I think this is pretty standard operating procedure for corporations to participate in policy dialogue, and Transurban is no different to any other company that I'm aware of on the ASX in relation.
So it's a payment in order to participate in policy dialogue?
You go to lunches and you participate in discussions. It's not unusual.
Okay, but this is not lunch money. This is money that appears to have been directly made to the Cormac Foundation.
Well, that I think we should clarify before we go down any further, because
Understood.
my understanding is that it may well be an investment they have made in the company, and there might be dividends that are paid and all those sorts of things, but as best of my knowledge at this moment, and I'm willing to go back and double check it, I'm not aware of Transurban making any donations to that foundation.
Thank you. It is on the AEC website. What was that? Sorry, Mr. Mallon? No, it was on. It's verified in a number of places. That's fine. Sorry, I will ignore the interjections. Can I ask you, coming back then to the admin fees that we were talking about before, just a couple of extra questions to round that discussion out. Has that $10 for a first notice and $20 for a second notice changed over time?
Look, I think we were probably a little bit careful in the way we responded to that last time. I'll be a bit more frank. The $10 and the $20 is a government process. We participate in it. We have proposed changes over a number of years, including in the submission. The changes that we have proposed and made some progress on include early notification reform. So I talked a little bit about that, and Michelle did as well. And we're in dialogue, and it's in the submission, that we think a bundling of the toll notices would be another useful reform, but we need to convince Transport for New South Wales and the government to do it.
In the concession agreement tolling schedule, it very explicitly says that the amount of the admin fees will be as reasonably determined by the project company, which would be yourselves. Are you saying that's not the case?
We need to, any fees that we propose as part of the concession deed need to be put to Transport for New South Wales, our regulator, and they go through them with a fine-tooth comb and ensure that there is nothing other than costs being covered. And it's a very rigorous process.
So that's right, but it's proposed by you. It's not something that you wait on them for. You come up with how much.
Well,
you
in
think.
my experience, you can propose it, but in my experience, what typically happens is there's an MOU group that consists of lots of toll road operators and lots of toll road owners, and often those discussions include interstate discussions. And it's more often than not, in my experience, that any of those ideas are first ventilated and raised there.
So basically the $10 and the $20, has that always been the same, or has
as far
it
as
changed
I'm
over
aware,
time?
I don't remember it ever being different to that, and it's prescribed by the government.
Okay,
It's
and
a government process.
under the terms of the Northconnex concession deed, it talks about the quarterly review. So it says the project company, being yourselves, may review an administration charge once each quarter. Has that happened with Transurban? Do you review it every quarter and come up with what the current cost?
We review our costs, we review our processes on a very regular basis. Some of the reviews are more than quarterly to make sure that we stick to fees being only reflective of the cost that is incurred in administering them, to make sure that we don't make any profit out of them.
Yep.
And there are also regular independent audits that are undertaken to make sure that these are.
But those costs over time have stayed at exactly $10 and exactly $20 for a second note, so $30 for that process has stayed exactly the same over time.
Can I just clarify? It's not $30.
Okay.
It's 10 or 20.
10
it's
or 20.
It's semantics, but yeah, it's 10 or
But
20. It's not 10 plus 20.
So it's 10 and then 10.
Well, 10 and then another 10, yeah, but
Yeah,
it's not,
okay,
it's
all
not
right.
30.
No, that's really useful. I had misunderstood. I thought it was 30. Okay, that's good. So it's 10 plus 10. So that 10 and then 10 has stayed exactly the same in terms of
As far as I can
covering-
remember, that's the case.
Right.
The other thing that I think it is worthwhile pointing out is if a $10 toll notice is
Mm.
received and then a customer intervenes early, which is why we want to get to them early and tell
Mm.
them that there's been a problem in the process, if they then identify an account for the toll to be matched against, the $10 is wiped and there's a small fee. I think it's $1.20 from memory. Again,
Yep.
don't hold me to that, but
Yeah.
so that's the process as it works. But as far as I'm aware, the 10 and the 20 hasn't changed for as long as I can remember.
Do you think that's reasonable, given that, as you mentioned before, Ms. Huey, you've reaching efficiencies of scale. There is, back office improvements.
Because it's
Yeah.
a government process, I think that one's best put to transport.
There are also many factors that drive the changes. So if we're considering what has changed over the last 10 years, the number of motorists, the number of assets, the number of roads that are undertaken and trips that are undertaken have changed significantly. And then on our side, the investments that we have made to make sure that we continue to improve the processes we have.
Yep.
And so it's probably a combination of all of those factors.
It is curious, though, isn't it, that's exactly $10. Like, if we are talking about recovering the real actual costs to Transurban, that it would stay at exactly $10, when for people who are experiencing significant hardship, even if it was $9.80, it would be a significant difference to them.
Well,
Don't you think that's curious? It
well,
stayed at
can I
$10.
clarify again? So an image matching fee, for instance, on one of our roads is the size of that, and the process we go through to justify that is that the number is proposed by us and is audited and checked and tested by Transport. The $10 and the $20, we didn't set that, we didn't propose it. That's a government process, and I think the question should be put to government rather than
I understand, but under the concession deed, it is Transurban that has the power to set it. It is Transurban
No,
that
Transurban doesn't
proposes
have
it.
power to set those. We have an ability to propose them, and our regulator is the one who ultimately signs it off.
Yes, but
We are
the
very
process begins with you proposing it.
But as far as I'm aware, in relation to the 10 and the 20, I don't think we proposed that. That's what I'm saying.
Would you perhaps take on notice
Of course,
exactly where that comes from, and what the
Yeah, yeah.
process is from your perspective for
Yeah.
changing it, how it differs from the deed that I have in front of me? That would be very useful. And the final question on this is around, Ms. Huey, you mentioned before that, some of the costs included in determining the administration fee include things like the cameras and stuff that are set up at the toll capture points. To what extent are you including the whole cost of that within the admin fees, as opposed to just the percentage that would come from additionally needing to use those cameras for catching people who are going through without an e-tag?
I wonder if I'm trotting into an area that's a bit too detailed, and I can,
Yeah.
if I can take the opportunity to come back to the committee to fully explain, because I think even within the equipment that is installed on the roadside, the equipment serve a lot of different purposes. Some of them are for tag reading, some of them are safety, CCTV monitoring, others are monitoring traffic flow, and then others, as we mentioned, are capturing images and measuring heights and lengths of vehicles to make sure that we are able to execute the tolling regime.
If you could come back to me with the exact costs involved that are actually referable, and maybe that's something that you have available because you give it to, as you say, you give it to the Transport for New South Wales at some point, and we will be taking this up with them as well. But I'm concerned that you could effectively be shifting costs.
No, I understand.
And I'd like you to refute that. So if you could do that with evidence, that would be really useful. Unfortunately, I'm out of time, so I will go to the government.
Thank you.
Earlier today, we, as you probably observed, had the ACCC give evidence, and it was some of their points about their assessment of the Westconnex transaction I thought were helpful in terms of informing the competitive tension that always needs to be there with you and your competitors. Do you want to just go through briefly for us the process you went through the ACCC to get, for example, I asked the question directly. They've green flagged you for that transaction. They didn't orange flag it. They just, and generally principle in their submission to us is that they actually support tolling regime in terms of road user pays as a more efficient model. But do you just want to go through the process you went through with ACCC?
Well, the ACCC has analysed and assessed 7 transactions. 2 of them related to Westconnex. I was involved in one and Michelle was involved in one. But you're absolutely right. The ACCC provided a green light in both cases. And I wasn't able to listen to their testimony this morning, but I understand that they were pretty comfortable with the outcome of both those 2 transactions that related to Westconnex.
They were keen for the government to encourage Westconnex, or anyone else for that matter, to release data about road users and volumes to the market or to potential bidders, and give bidders time to build their own model. I mean, what would be your response to that?
Well, yes, that was an outcome of the 2018 review, and we have been very happy to provide that information. It's all publicly available. It's very, very detailed and very comprehensive, so we release the data in 15-minute increments, and it's provided on a website every quarter. And I understand from the traffic modelling market, which is ultimately what was related to, that all of the data that is sufficiently required to undertake traffic modelling exercises is now available to anybody who wants to undertake that.
Okay. Well, that's thankful and useful information. I just want to go to, I think this is in the KPMG report, but I just unpackage the issue of trauma and the reduction of car accidents and I mean, we all care about injuries and trauma on our roads, and the evidence from what I understand just from the submission is that it has been dramatically reduced. Do you want to talk about that for us? And there's a personal saving, but also economic saving, of course.
Yeah, and we share commonality in being very concerned about safety, whether it's worker safety in terms of the welfare of people that we have responsibility for, or broader road safety, which is anybody who uses our roads. There is a report which we have also shared in our submission that looks at comparing Transurban operated motorways and other comparable roads, and it was done by the Monash University Accident Research Centre. And I think summarising that at a very high level, the conclusion out of all of those reviews which have happened over a number of years, we've concluded that the Transurban motorways are roughly twice as safe for road users than comparable roads. It's something that we've worked really hard on, and it's something that we'll continue to do. As you mentioned, trauma or road incidents and accidents isn't just a direct impact on the people that are involved. It creates a huge ripple effect, whether it's to the extended family and friends and people that are involved and related and connected to the individuals, or whether economically, whether it is on the immediate side of causing congestion, traffic disruption, and then of course the broader economic impact, which we have also covered as part of the KPMG report. But it is certainly an area that is really important to us. We set very strict standards. We have very high expectations on how we manage our roads to the best of the safety outcomes.
Yeah, okay. I notice how quickly you drop it down to 40k when someone's pulled over or something like that to maintain that safety standard in the roads. That would be a reduction because service roads have so many traffic lights and intersecting roads and opportunities for accidents, and it's removed by a motorway. That's basically the reason, is it? So it's for higher safety standards, I guess, on the motorway.
Yeah, in terms of managing traffic on our motorways, it's not decisions that are solely made by us. We do engage with the industry, the wider industry, and also relevant agencies, emergency services, to make sure that the traffic management approach is consistent, so that from a customer perspective, they don't have to get to know different conditions depending on what roads they travel on. I think in the case of managing speed or reducing speed, where there's an incident ahead or whether there's incident response on site or emergency services on site, I think it's something that across the industry it's a common practice, not unique to our roads, but it's something that we see as a safety measure that is important for the people that are undertaking whatever activity they are on the roadside, to make sure that the passing traffic is done in a safe manner.
Okay. No, I appreciate that. My final area of discussion is and I appreciate, Mr. Head, your opening statement around and it's in your submission and your sort of covering note, the parkland and tree planting and something that's quite dear to my heart, that type of area of benefits to the community. So I want to just touch on the environmental benefits of motorways. And you've got some information on air pollution, some early data, I think, on Westconnex, on air pollution quality on the surface versus before the motorway was built, and maybe just some broader environmental benefits.
Yeah, well, you're absolutely right. So we undertook a study about 12 months after the M4 East opened up. And as I said in the opening statement, the traffic on Parramatta Road has dropped significantly. And we've also seen a 10 to 15% improvement in air quality. We will undertake similar sorts of studies at appropriate times when other assets come online. And I think there's a plan at some stage to do it on Northconnex as well. But these are benefits that we expect to see when you bring a modern motorway online. You've got the trucks and the cars travelling through those motorways with less stopping and starting, burning less fuel, creating less emissions. And we're running the tunnels themselves in a more efficient way. So we've just recently signed up. We're both very proud of this. We got together and signed a deal to do all of our tunnels, power them with wind power out of the Central West and the north west of New South Wales. So we're now at Westconnex, for instance, we're over 90% renewable energy on all of the motorways. And then, of course, as you referenced in your introduction, we're very passionate about trying to restore construction facilities in particular back to the community within the boundaries of the government's broader policy to create local parks. We're planting a lot of trees and shrubs. We're improving places. So St Peter's Interchange, for instance, was formerly a landfill site. We are now in the process of regenerating that. We're hoping to turn it into a park. Has lots of pedestrian and walkways there. We've got sculptures going in. We're using those sculptures to educate children who are going through the New South Wales curriculum. So there's lots and lots of different things that Westconnex is doing over and above just digging a tunnel. And more and more of those will become apparent to the citizens of inner Western and Western Sydney over the course of the next few years.
So Transurban, am I right in saying you've signed up to net zero emissions by 2050?
We have, and we've also set ourselves other targets as well. So there's the net zero towards 2050. We are the first ASX 20, to the extent that my understanding is correct, to have signed up to a science-based emission target. And then well before that, back in 2013, we've also set ourselves a 10 in 10 energy reduction target. So all these targets, which are measurable and we focus on them, both address the absolute reduction in energy consumption, then also, as Andrew mentioned, the source of the energy for the remaining power that we do need to consume.
Okay. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I just want to quickly deal with this Cormac Foundation issue. And I just had a 5-second research, and I think you're quite right that it is dividends, and it's actually listed not as a donation receipt, as other donations are, but as other receipts, along with ANZ, Coles, Woolworths, and a whole range of other companies. And I will say from the outset that the Cormac Foundation is in no way associated with the New South Wales Liberal Party, nor have we ever received $1. But anyway, it's just moving on from that point. They're still probably in litigation with the Victorian Liberal Party, I think, at the moment.
Nothing to do with us.
Moving on from that point, just in terms of some of the other issues that we've heard during the inquiry. So the call for IPART to be involved in setting the rise in charges each year. Have you got any feedback or thoughts on that at all?
Maybe I start and Michelle can add anything if she'd like to. So We have been through a number of different processes, be they bids or procurement of PPPs or whatever it may be, and I've always found the government's process to be very robust. It always includes a probity auditor, and there are a number of long-established government systems and processes to ensure value for money. And on the outside, once these things have been delivered, for instance, Northconnex, Auditor General found that it was value for money. So we are operating within the existing process. We're aware that others are proposing other things. We haven't really made any statements for or against any of those. We're very focused on what's required today, and those processes are very robust.
Now, I guess in terms of what this committee is looking at as well is to the future and not just what's there today. And I think that we've had a lot of suggestions that have come before the committee. I think they were dealt with before somewhat in terms of, time of day tolling, a distance charge on the network, some sort of zonal charges that we have an ability to look at the network as one potentially. I know that you're happy to have any discussions, and you've indicated that to the committee, but just looking at how we would unpick that and unscramble the egg, so to speak, what would be involved in terms of renegotiation? What's on the table effectively?
I mean, as we talked about, concessions are legally binding commercial contracts. Having said that, given our long-term interest in Sydney, we want to make sure that the role that we continue to play supports Sydney's growth aspirations. And so we haven't really thought beyond being open to having a dialogue, because it very much depends on where government and policymakers want to take this conversation, if there's a conversation to be had.
So effectively you're open to it, and any of the contracts could be revisited, but of course there would have to be, I imagine, compensation if there are any changes that were envisaged in one way or another.
And there are lots of different groups of stakeholders. We're speaking on behalf of Transurban and Westconnex. There are also a long list of partners that co-invest with us that will need to be part of that conversation. And so I think there's a bit more thinking before we can come back and give you a definitive answer on what would be our response.
Okay, thank you for that. Now, with respect, I think that this 4% escalation often comes up in debate, and I guess there's different things that we hear on that. One is that it should be tacked to CPI, and that 4% of course exceeds the usual CPI increase. I think, as Mr. Mallard talked about before, in terms of this isn't just building a road and set and forget. There's maintenance costs, there's a cost to capital that you have in terms of Transurban. Could you just maybe outline your views on that, and why perhaps the escalation cost should not be just tacked to CPI? And why there are additional costs potentially from your perspective?
I take you back to my opening statement. So when a government, in my experience, is trying to determine what the right mix is, they're taking into account whether they should put any money in themselves, should they build it by themselves, should they use user pays or not do it at all. And then there's some elements in our submission that talk about those challenges once you get into the finer points of it. There's obviously the capital cost that you've got to recover. There's the maintenance costs over the period, and then determining how long a concession ought to be, what the price should be when you start, what the escalation rate factors into all of those things. But I just need to stress that, again, those decisions are made right up front by government, and we can't change them. And it really doesn't matter who owns the concession, whether it was owned by the state, in the case of Westconnex before it was sold down progressively, or it's owned by someone in the private sector. That 4% escalator was set up front. And in the case of Westconnex, it was set by the government in 2013, and the justification for it was to smooth the costs of construction operations and maintenance over that period. So they're tough decisions, they're difficult propositions to put together, and those people who are thinking about that when they're putting them together have to consider all those variables and try and come up with the best possible proposition to make the project happen and have the customer happy.
Are there escalators on the Eastern Distributor, across City Tunnel, Westlink M7, the Lane Cove Tunnel?
Yeah, and they all vary in different
They all
degrees.
have, all set by Labor governments. They're all good escalators.
Oh, yes, yes.
And there's a mix of CPI-based, AWE-based, and other mechanisms as well across the motorways.
Thank you. Just as a point of order, because it was raised by Mr. Farlow, the question in relation to the donations still stands as being on notice because it is also direct donations to the Liberal Party as well. And if you could clarify that dividend point, presumably that means that the Cormac Foundation owns shares in Transurban. So from a Liberal's perspective, you're a shareholder in Transurban.
Victorians, not us.
Oh, oh, right. You have nothing to do with that.
Well, no, it doesn't actually. The Liberal Party New South Wales division is not an associated entity.
Oh, okay.
Like the Greens, international conspiracists.
Okay, I think that's a fitting end to the hearing for today. Thank you very much for attending and for your considerable time and the detailed submission that you gave today. The questions that you took on notice need to be returned within 21 days, but the committee secretariat will be in touch to discuss that. Thank you again, and that concludes today's hearing.
Thank you, Chair. Thank you, committee.